Well, this is a video that I've been looking forward to doing for a long time now. I promised this my last political video that I would make a how I would vote in every U.S. presidential election video, and here we are today, about a week and a half or so later. As you'll notice, of course, this is going to be part one of two. I want to split this into two videos because I have a lot to say about this, and we're going to be going through around roughly 60 elections here. So if I were to go through every single one, we would be here for several hours. So to spare you guys some time, I'm going to split this into two different videos. For this first one, we are going to be going through the elections of 1788 through 1900. Why 1900 in particular? Because that is the end of the 19th century. The 20th century began January 1st, 1901. So we'll be going through every single election from the very end of the 18th century going into the very last one of the 19th century. And then I think that's a good halfway mark we can stop at. So this is pretty much going to be almost exactly like my other videos where I have a whole slideshow prepared here ready to go for you. I'll give you the details of the main candidates, and we'll just pretty much go from there. And you'll notice this is a little bit different than my ranking videos. The screen is not completely, of course, taken up by the slideshow itself. I also have opened up a couple tabs here, the Wikipedia article regarding every single election, which we can easily navigate between presidential elections here if I wish, and to get some extra knowledge on some of the candidates or some of the other, just to fact check myself if need be, or and of course this extra little special sheet that I made for myself called 30-40-30. Which I will explain to you in just a moment. This will be used just as a little helpful cheat sheet to go and type in some extra little details in to go and reveal why I'm voting the way that I am voting. So this took me quite a long time in order to prepare for. It's not going to be 100% perfect, but I feel it's about as accurate as I really want it to be at this current stage. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in. I can get my thing to work. There we go. So before I actually reveal the the elections or the candidates themselves, there are a few things that I wish to note. First and foremost, that cheat sheet that you saw with 30-40-30, for a majority of these elections here, I like to follow this little rule guide that I created for myself that helps me determine what I feel is the best candidate. In order to determine the best candidate, I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, there are a few exceptions here and there. I follow what I call the 30-40-30 rule, which means that when I'm looking at each candidate, I determine the following. Adding up to 100%, meaning I'm 100% certain about my vote. 30% is judged on experience, how much knowledge they have prior to gaining office. What have they done? Or have they been a governor? Have they served in Congress? Have they served in the cabinet? Have they been vice president? Etc., etc. 40% character. The most important thing to me when electing officials is who are they as a person? Are they morally sound? Do they have good ethics? Do they have integrity? Are they, not racist? Things like that. Just do they have a good personality, and are they likable human beings? Character is the most important thing for me, so I rank it higher above everything else, so 40% character. And of course, one cannot ignore the platform, what they stand for. 30% platform. Do they stand for raising taxes or lowering taxes? Do they stand for abortion or not abortion? Things like that. Some issues that these candidates stood for, I am not necessarily extremely passionate about one way or another, so it's not really going to influence my vote. So if someone were to go and say, oh, what's your position on free trade, for example, like what it was back in the early 2000s, do you like NAFTA or something like that? I really couldn't care one way or another. As long as I have a job at the end of the day and I can come home and pay my bills and everything's perfectly fine, I could care less one way or the other. Foreign policy is not the biggest issue for me a majority of the time. Well, it kind of depends unless we're at war or about ready to go to war, or if it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for things for the purposes of this video at this point in time. But pretty much for me, there are a couple of issues that are very important to me, more so than others, but not every single one is extremely important. If both candidates stand for the same thing, well, then we'll just look at something else. If one stands for something but not something else, but I don't really care either way, well, then that's not going to influence my vote. I think you pretty much get it. Of course, you'll notice a little asterisk right next to the 30-40-30 rule. That means, of course, under most normal circumstances. There are some pretty unique elections that have happened over the 220-something years that we've been a country, or 240, I guess, now at this point. So this will not apply to every single one of them. You'll know them when you see them. A couple other things. A candidate must have gotten at least 5% or more of the popular vote to qualify as a headlining candidate. For example, in the election of 2000, alongside the two frontrunners, George W. Bush and Al Gore, there was also, most infamously, Ralph Nader. There was Pat Buchanan. There was a whole bunch of other third-party candidates. I will not be including Ralph Nader or Pat Buchanan on this list because they did not get 5% or more of the popular vote. The only exception to this rule is if they got electoral votes. There are some votes in like the mid-1900s where the candidates who won a lot of Southern electoral votes got less than 5% of the popular vote. Again, we'll get to them when we get to them, but I will be including them because technically they did have a decent chance of, winning. So if a candidate received 5% or more of the popular vote or won electoral votes, they will be considered a headliner and someone who I would more than likely vote for. Again, there are a few exceptions here and there, but again, we'll get to them when we get to them. With that being said, major party candidates take precedence, which I think, again, kind of explains the 5% or more popular vote rule that I have on here. I'm going to continue this throughout my entire life as I vote, want to actually try and give a vote to a person who I feel actually has a chance of winning. I feel like my vote is influential, and a single vote can literally tip the scale between one opponent winning or one opponent losing. Again, as the election of 2000. Had 537 people change their votes, we would have had a President Gore instead of another President Bush. Just saying. So I think every single vote can make a single difference. So my idea is, if you can vote for a major party candidate, the ones that have the most likely chance of winning, and your vote can tip the scale towards who you want to win, do so. That's my way of thinking when it comes to voting. So major party candidates take precedence in every single one of these elections. And I'm going to be voting with the mindset of where I would have most likely lived during these elections based on my own preferences. If I could live anywhere in the United States today, or if I would have had the chance to live anywhere in the United States at any point in time, where would I have chosen? For me, it would have been the northeastern United States. So we're talking right around New England area, right, maybe a little south, somewhere between like, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania area, stuff like that. Kind of roughly right around in that generalized area. And also, one final thing I want to say, I am not a partisan voter. I do not vote solely for one party or another, so if you're watching this video and expecting me to vote for every single Republican candidate ever since the very beginning, that's not going to happen. I switch my vote between both sides of the ticket depending upon who I feel is going to be most qualified at the time to lead the country. If I like the way the country is going and there's a Republican who's running, okay, I might vote for them. If I like the way the country's going and the Dems are currently in office, cool, I'll vote for them. If I like it the other way, well, then I'll vote for the opposing party. It doesn't matter. I'm not limiting myself to political party loyalty alone, like a lot of Americans do in modern day, which I get. I get why that is. There's a very logical reason why people do not like Democrats and why a lot of people do not like Republicans. Fair enough. But for me, if I had to pick a political party to lean towards, I would pick neither. I would consider myself an independent. I don't want to be associated with political parties. I do not want to, really follow any one way or the other of the political parties in the modern day, or even back then, as I think they're all rotten. I just think I'm looking solely on the candidates more often than not for every single one of these votes. So, with all of that spiel out of the way, We will start, of course, with the very first presidential election of 1788 to 1789. This is, of course, one of 3 presidential elections where the main person who was in the running for the votes pretty much ran all opposed. Now, this is, of course, a time in history that exceeds the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which pretty much states that when people vote for like a person for president, they are voting for both a person for president and vice president, like a main primary candidate and then a running mate. Back from 1788 to 89 through the election of 1800, there were actually 2 separate votes being casted. So the person who got the most electoral votes, in this case, of course, George Washington, would become president, and the person who received the second highest amount of electoral votes would become vice president. Now, if that sounds kind of strange, assume for a second in 2024, or no, I won't use 2024. Let's say, again, I'll go back to 2000 again. Let's say, for the record, that the results happen, and if we were still living pre-12th Amendment and the election of 2000 happened, that would pretty much mean that George W. Bush would become president and Al Gore would be vice president. And considering the 2 are radically different when it comes to political beliefs, one can understand how that would be a bit of a problem. So, as George Washington is the only one who is, I guess, technically in the running for president here, although technically all of these men could theoretically become president, but since, again, you're voting for 2 people to become president and vice president, and everyone was voting for Washington to get first place, that would obviously mean, by default, I'd be voting for George Washington for president. So the intrigue of this first election here is more so who would I want to have as his vice president. Now, there were several different candidates for vice president. I will slide down here real quick to the ballot if I can find it. Here it is. You'll notice roughly 9-10 people right here, all split up between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The only Anti-Federalist here was George Clinton, who you'll be hearing about a lot in these first couple of elections. Pretty much Federalists are the people who support the new U.S. Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists who do not. Like the ones who want a good, strong, centralized government, and the ones who do not, put plain and simply. So the 3 here that I have are kind of the top 3 vote getters on here. Or, well, the top 2 vote getters, and then one who I wanted to include just because I think he's the only other really noteworthy or knowledgeable person to include on a list like this. So, of course, we have John Adams, who by this time was known as one of the most intelligent men, I think, in politics at this time, alongside like the likes of Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. He had been minister to 3 different countries, like the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, France. He, of course, was a founding father, went to the Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So lots of good experience, very level-headed individual here. We have John Jay, who was minister to Spain for a little while, of course. Also went to the was also part of the Continental Congress, and I believe was also a member of the Congress of the Confederation, like the Confederate sorry, not Confederation, of like the Constitutional Congress, if you will. I can't remember exactly what it's called off the top of my head. But he's also known for writing a couple of the Federalist Papers, which are like the basic drafting points of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, arguing for the Constitution. So a lot of good experience there. And then John Hancock, who was pretty much just known for being the guy who wrote the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence, but he was also governor of Massachusetts for a little while, so a good chunk of experience there as well too. But when it comes to who I would vote for vice president, I would go with John Adams, because I feel he is the most, level-headed, the most experienced, kind of just the one who would fit the role the best, if you will. So moving on to 1792, and 1792 was pretty much the exact same as 1788-89. George Washington's running unopposed again, so of course I'm voting for him. Now, when it comes to the running mate position, I would choose John Adams once again. But this is also the time when the first two major political parties are starting to come about. John Adams representing the Federalists, or the people who want a more stronger federal government, versus George Clinton, the governor of New York at this time, who was representing the Democratic Republicans, although at this time they were just called the Republicans, who want like a smaller federal government, want to give more power to the states. So during this time, I would have leaned more towards the Federalists. I believe a stronger central government is a good thing, because you need to have, centralized power. Otherwise, everything's just going to turn into complete and utter chaos. I mean, you see that happen multiple times in United States history. So, especially for a brand new country that has barely existed for not even 20 years yet, thinking that it's a good idea to not have, a good, strong central power. I get that, that's pretty much just like Britain, who we rebelled against. I get that, but at the same time, though, we had other, checks and balances in place that made us different than Britain at the time. So I think that having a good central government would have been a good idea. So I would have leaned Federalist for this election. So 1796, this is really the first election that is actually provides me with a real choice, if you will, to go for. We have the incumbent Vice President John Adams, the Federalist, versus the former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Of course, John Adams is from Massachusetts, so he's a Northerner. Thomas Jefferson is from Virginia, just like George Washington, so he's a Southerner. Who would I have voted for in this election? So this is where, again, my 30-40-30 rule kind of comes into play. So if I were to go and take a look at the experience of John Adams, at this point he has been vice president for 8 years, which, if anyone actually knows, the role of the vice presidency is actually not that powerful, or at least it wasn't back in these days. There was only real two big responsibilities that the vice president really had, which was presiding over Senate meetings, so pretty much being the president of the Senate, and certifying the Electoral College vote at the end of every single presidential election. And that is pretty much it. Of course, in the more modern day, the vice presidency has become a bigger role. It's sometimes seen as an actual member of the president's cabinet. They're like the head of like certain like councils or different things for the president, kind of like an actual cabinet member. But again, back then, the vice presidency was a pretty much nothing role. And John Adams infamously even said that he felt wasted, like a wasted opportunity being the vice president at the time when he assumed the role. But he still took the role very seriously, did a damn good job. Probably one of the best vice presidents we've had during this period. And then you have Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, which is definitely more powerful and very, very active role in government. It's like the central cabinet position, if you will. It's the one that every politician wants to get, if you can, because that was like the big stepping stone at this point in time between yourself and the presidency. Everyone who was elected during these early years of the presidency were secretaries of state. So for this one, for me, it kind of comes down to, again, my 30-40-30 rule. So experience, technically, I would say Thomas Jefferson would have more experience than John Adams did. Yes, John Adams has been like minister to 3 different countries across his lifetime. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, so he was a founding father. He was vice president for 2 terms. But again, vice president is not really a big role, as I just mentioned. Versus Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State. That's a very big point in his pocket. Minister of France, Governor of Virginia, so he has executive experience, and of course, pretty much the same legislative experiences that John Adams does. However, at this time, I do not believe that the vice presidency would have been very well known for what role it was. And again, the title of vice president technically makes it seem like you're the second highest man in government, and to be fair, that's technically true. It's the second highest position in the United States government. So if I was alive at this time, I do not believe I would have been like extremely knowledgeable of what vice president like really meant aside from that. So hearing your second man in command is willing to take forth the post, I would have assumed that John Adams would have had more experience. So on this one, with the knowledge that I would have had, John Adams wins the 30 rule. Character. I don't like John Adams as a person. He was very, what am I trying to say here? Hot-headed. He was a very hot-headed individual. There are multiple quotes across history from Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, a lot of John Adams' peers who described him as, although a brilliant man, someone very difficult to get along with, a very abrasive kind of person. So, versus Thomas Jefferson, who, despite absolutely hating public speaking, was a little bit more warm, welcoming, and friendly for the most part, as far as I'm aware. I'm not like a super huge expert on how Thomas Jefferson was personally. Yes, he owned slaves, which is a terrible thing. As a matter of fact, from what I remember, he owned more slaves than any president in history, versus John Adams, who did not. But then again, Northerner versus Southerner kind of makes sense. So for character, I would give the win to Thomas Jefferson. When it comes to platform, it's pretty much the two parties: stronger central government versus weakened, central government. So John Adams would win for me when it comes to platform. So because of that, I would have voted for John Adams in 1796. Now, when it comes to the vice presidential candidate, these two down. So there's 5 names you can see here: Thomas Pinckney, Oliver Ellsworth, John Jay, and then Aaron Burr and George Clinton. These 3 men underneath Adams's picture were Federalists, and these 2 down here were Democratic Republicans. So I would have, of course, wanted to keep the the party the same, of course, and not have 2 separate parties become president and vice president, which, of course, is what actually happened in this election. John Adams became president, and his rival Thomas Jefferson from the opposing party became vice president. So instead, I would have cast my vote for one of these 3 men down here. Thomas Pinckney, he was governor of, I believe, South Carolina. Let's go ahead and take a look. I'm pretty sure it was South Carolina off the top of my head. 1796. There's Thomas Pinckney. Yes. Governor of South Carolina, minister to Great Britain at this time, so a little bit of foreign policy experience and some executive experience. Not bad. Oliver Ellsworth, pretty much mostly known for, at that time, being the Chief Justice of the United States. So let's go ahead and pull up Oliver Ellsworth. He was the incumbent Chief Justice. Was a senator from Connecticut, which is, that's pretty much all he had. He was also a founding father, too, so he was, a framer of the United States Constitution here, senator, so a little bit of experience, but not really a ton. And then there's John Jay, who, not only I feel was the most politically experienced at this time, as he was also a founding father. He wrote 5 of the Federalist Papers during the Constitutional Convention. But he was also the first Chief Justice of the United States. He was what they call, and this is actually kind of silly, I'm going to pull this up here, the United States Secretary of Foreign Affairs, which is apparently a very fancy way of saying Secretary of State, confirmed under the Congress of the Confederation, and then later again by George Washington himself, and then he actually became acting Secretary of State before Thomas Jefferson officially took on the role. So he has good foreign policy experience there too. Again, Minister to Spain. But he was also, most importantly for this, At the time of this election, the governor of New York. So he also had executive experience. He had judicial experience. He had foreign policy experience. He had legislative experience. He's the total package. John Jay would have gotten my vote for vice president in 1796. So, of course, John Adams wins. Thomas Jefferson becomes the vice president. So we skip ahead to the election of 1800 for very long years later. This is a rematch, of course, between the from the previous election. At this point, John Adams would have been seen as extremely unpopular across the entire country, mostly because of his foreign affairs with supporting Britain versus France. And in my personal opinion, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which many historians and myself agree is one of the worst laws ever passed in American history, pretty much banning anyone from speaking out against the federal government and imprisoning them for saying anything bad about them. So essentially, it's a founding father who fought for the freedom of speech with the Declaration of Independence and whatnot. Everything that he did to help create and found the country essentially was thrown out the window because of this act. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to go check my air conditioner. The thing sometimes turns on and becomes loud, so turn that off so you can hear me better. So I would have been strongly against John Adams at this time. Technically, yes, as incumbent president, he would win experience, but just because I would be so anti-John Adams, my vote would have gone to Thomas Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr, his running mate for vice president, since they were technically both in the same party. Now, yes, I know the name Aaron Burr is pretty much known for only one thing these days, and that's, shooting and killing Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. But kind of similar to what happened to 1796, where the opposing party became vice president, I wouldn't want that to happen again, so I would suck it up and reluctantly vote for Aaron Burr, who I personally think, even before knowing what he would have done, was not really a particularly likable person. He was kind of stubborn, kind of hot-headed, kind of just did what he wanted to do because I don't really like people like that, so he would have been a person I would have definitely not liked taking the presidency, and he almost did in this election. As you can see here, the electoral map, it was 73 to 65. 73 electoral votes went to Jefferson, and 65 went to John Adams. But as this is still pre-12th Amendment, the votes were supposed to be that one elector, like who cast the electoral votes, was supposed to cast another vote for like George Clinton or another Democratic Republican who was not Aaron Burr, but they messed up and gave the electoral vote to Aaron Burr anyway, thus essentially tying these two men for the presidency. So essentially what that means is they are throwing the election to the House of Representatives, who then had to go and vote which individual became president. And of course, largely thanks to Alexander Hamilton's influence, in the mostly still Federalist House, they elected Thomas Jefferson as president. So I would have voted for Thomas Jefferson, even though I would have leaned more Federalist at the time. It's just John Adams would have put such a sour taste in my mouth that I would have wanted him out of there. So 1804, it's Charles Cotesworth Pinckney versus Thomas Jefferson, the incumbent president. I don't think this would come as too much of a surprise that I would vote for Thomas Jefferson in this election. The economy is great. He's doing a great job in office so far. Louisiana Purchase, of course, which would have been extremely popular at this time, where he pretty much, bought the Louisiana Territory and pretty much doubled the entire size of the country, if you will. Again, I still probably would have been leaning pretty heavily Federalist at this time, but Thomas Jefferson was such an effective leader that I wouldn't want to see him out of office. That and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney is just such not only a pretty terrible campaigner, but was also extremely inexperienced. Like, if you look him up on Wikipedia, I'll actually do so right now for you. There he is right here. The only thing that he has on him is Minister to France for not even a whole year under George Washington. And yes, he was also a signer of the Constitution, mentions right here, went to the Constitutional Convention, but so did this man. I mean, okay, I know he didn't go to the Constitutional Convention, but he was also a founding father who had just as much, just as much of a role in helping the founding of this country as this man did, if not more. So I would have voted for Thomas Jefferson, of course, and his running mate, which at this point they are now officially combined. So no more 2 votes, just 1 now. I would have voted for George Clinton to replace Aaron Burr as vice president. And George Clinton, again, as previously mentioned, was governor of New York. So moving on to 1808, Thomas Jefferson, of course, chooses not to run for re-election, doing the exact same thing that Washington chose to do, establish a 2-term presidential limit. It was pretty much just seen as tradition at this time. There was nothing stopping Washington or Jefferson from running again, but they wanted to, well, Washington wanted to retire, and he wanted people to move on from the same leader, and Jefferson chose to honor that. So in his place, he recommends his Secretary of State, James Madison, to run against the same candidate from 1804. So even though Thomas Jefferson would have been a little bit more, I don't want to say unlikable, but some of his policies and some of the things that he'd done in his second term would have been kind of turned me off, especially in regards to the Embargo Act of 1807, which raised tariffs and pretty much killed trade between the United States and a lot of foreign countries, and thus hurt the economy pretty badly. I still would have voted for his Secretary of State, James Madison, because the incumbent party would have been doing super well, and again, experience is a big thing for me, and James Madison just wins it in boatloads. He's also from Virginia, of course, does own slaves, but definitely not as big up in your face about it as what either the Pinckneys were. Either, go back a little bit here, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney or Thomas Pinckney, who were brothers. So I would have voted for James Madison because I thought where the country currently was, for the most part, was pretty decent, and we could just continue down that path. So now we'll move on to 1812, where we have James Madison, the incumbent president, running against another technical Democratic Republican who was actually informally endorsed, or endorsed is the right word, by the Federalists, because they didn't really want to go and split the opposition against James Madison. And this is DeWitt Clinton. He, at this time, was from New York, hence why he won New York on this map. This is also the closest presidential election you can technically see up to this point. Right here is much closer than the last one. But he was a senator for about a year and a half, following which he was Attorney General of New York and was mayor of New York City for a couple of terms. Definitely does not have that much experience, a little bit of executive, because he was mayor in one of the biggest cities in the entire country at the time, and still to this day is. But was just not super impressive when it comes to his resume and experience. So I would give the thing to James Madison for that one. Again, incumbent president running for re-election. Now this time, the country was about ready to go to war again with Great Britain, not even 50 years after we had fought the American Revolution. So James Madison has effectively turned into a war leader, if you will, putting the commander-in-chief skills of the presidency to the test. And one of the many criticisms I often hear of James Madison is him getting us involved in the War of 1812 to begin with, and that is perfectly valid, and I'm willing to believe a lot of voters at the time would have seen the exact same thing, because it's like, why are we going to war with this country again? There is no real point to that. But the biggest thing for me is if a country is at war with one of the most powerful nations in the entire world at the time, and still, again, kind of is, you kind of don't really want to throw away the leader that's currently presiding, because it makes sense to just kind of keep them in there. You don't want that big of a shakeup, because that could very well go and mean the loss of said war for the country. What was I going to say? That and DeWitt Clinton, his character flaws are one of the most egregious on this entire list that I'm making here. Where if you can find yourself a more standard definition of shady politician in American history, I would like you to try and point it out to me, because DeWitt Clinton was pretty much well known about this election for being a two-face. Speaking, he was against the war in the North and trying to appease the Democratic Republicans up there, but then going down the South saying, well, yeah, we shouldn't go to war, or we should go to war. Basically saying what was popular in the North, but then turning around and saying the exact opposite in the South, saying he was for it in one region, and then turning around and going saying he wasn't in the other region, if you will. Which, if you were to go and say that today, imagine George W. Bush going and saying in parts of the country in 2000, oh yeah, I'll cut your taxes, and then in another part of the country the next day he would say, nah, I'm thinking I'm going to raise them. How fast would people not vote for him? Of course, at this time, people would not have known that as easily, because, news didn't travel around the country very fast. This is before the telegraph, this is before the Pony Express, this is before any real fast methods of communication existed to really display that egregious oversight of his effectively. But even still, maybe I should not be judging him because of that, because I don't think I would have known that. But even regardless, it's just another stain on Clinton's legacy. So him being kind of more just politician-esque, and just because he's really inexperienced and I don't want to throw off changed leadership in the middle of a war, I would have voted for James Madison in 1812. And his running mate at this time was Elbridge Gerry, as George Clinton had died in office. Elbridge Gerry is the governor of Massachusetts, and then the running mate, of course, of DeWitt Clinton. I'll go ahead and pull him up here. Jared Ingersoll, not a very experienced person. Like, the best he had, Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Very minor, kind of nothing role in terms of a major, like a countrywide election. So moving on to 1816, we have James Monroe, the incumbent Secretary of State, and incumbent Secretary of War too, I believe, with the current governor of New York, Daniel D. Tompkins, running against Rufus King, an incumbent senator from, I believe was it New York? I think it was New York. Yeah, from New York, with John E. Howard as his running mate. John E. Howard was a senator from Maryland, but had not served in office for around roughly 13 years, also governor of Maryland. So a little bit inexperienced for more modern touches, but not too bad. I don't think this comes as any surprise when they say I would vote for James Monroe here. The Federalists at this point had pretty much all but collapsed. They were originally super against the War of 1812, but then once the United States did super well in that war, thanks to Madison's leadership, they were pretty much all for it. So it makes no sense to go and re-elect someone who was like, oh yeah, I oppose this war, but now I support it. We did such a good job. Go us. It makes no sense. And again, experience-wise, James Monroe, go ahead and look him up. I'm not going to do here for time's sake. Pretty much blows Rufus King out of the water. So there's no surprise here that I would go and vote for James Monroe. This next one, 1820, is pretty much a nothing election, if you will. It was, the Federalists are gone. They don't exist anymore. James Monroe has a very successful first term in office, runs for re-election. No one even dares to try and challenge him. So he, runs pretty much unopposed and gets every single electoral vote except one, because reasons we will never understand. They instead vote for John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, who we'll get to in just a moment. But yeah, so since there's no other choice here, obviously James Monroe gets my vote in 1820, with of course Tompkins again as his running mate. All right. Finally, we're getting into an election that is very fun and interesting to talk about, which is the election of 1824. The first of several four-way race elections that happened in American history. There will be several others that we'll be talking about. And this one we have current Secretary of State John Quincy Adams versus the very famous general from the War of 1812, also a current senator of Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, versus the current Speaker of the House from Kentucky, Henry Clay, versus the current Secretary of the Treasury, William H. Crawford, which I actually do not know what state he is from, so let's go ahead and take a look. Georgia, my home state right now. Isn't that interesting? So, the interesting thing about this election here is, firstly, all four of these men are all part of the same political party, technically. They're all Democratic Republicans. So because of that, all of them pretty much agree on the issue. They pretty much have the same stance on all of the issues at the time. They don't really differ a whole bunch when it comes to, what the Democratic Republicans stood for at the time. So instead, this election really comes down to experience and character for me, because there really isn't anything big I can do regarding platform, because they're pretty much all the same. So first and foremost, I'm going to get the controversial statement out of the way right off the bat. I hate Andrew Jackson. Cannot stand the man. Even before what I would have known he would have done as president, he had a reputation, of course, by this time as getting in duels with over 100 people, even killing a few. He was known at this time as a pretty controversial general during the War of 1812. Very successful general, but controversial nonetheless. People even claim that he would even eat the skin of Native Americans and things like that. An extremely stubborn and hot-headed individual. Andrew Jackson is one of those people I think I would have just absolutely despised. And again, his presidency does help, and it makes me despise the man even more. But yeah, no. So I would definitely not vote for Andrew Jackson under any circumstances whatsoever. Next up, I'll talk about William Crawford, probably the most unknown candidate on this list. He was a Southerner, pro-slavery, definitely not a good look for him. Actually has some pretty good experience, senator from Georgia, and then President pro tempore of the Senate, the second highest position in the Senate aside from the Vice President. Minister of France, Secretary of War, and Secretary of the Treasury, so has good experience there, but pro-slavery, not a super inspiring candidate. There's not really much I would have liked about William Crawford. And again, assuming that I would have been living kind of more in the northeastern area of the United States at the time, and this is as south as south can possibly go, William H. Crawford would not have appealed to me. So that leaves Henry Clay, who you will be hearing about quite a bit over the next several elections, and John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams, I'll start with him, I would argue is probably the most experienced president we've ever had in American history. I mean, Secretary of State, that's after senator from Massachusetts. He was a diplomat to 4 different countries underneath 4 different presidential administrations: George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, and James Monroe, Secretary of State. So if there's anything that this man knows, it is foreign policy. And again, was part of the cabinet too, the best cabinet position to hold in order to make it to the presidency. And again, he was also a senator from Massachusetts, so he's right in the area where I more than likely would have been living, or close enough to where I would have liked to have been living at the time. So he has legislative experience, he has some good executive experience, he has diplomatic experience, very good right there. He is not a likable person. He's pretty much just like his dad, a pretty big, thick, hot-headed individual who is very difficult to get along with and is pretty much the definition of elitism, which is actually a criticism that his actual opponents in this election and the next one would use against him. He's pretty much like, oh, he's part of the rich and the top 1%. We should not vote for him. And in this election, that would have been a pretty big obstacle in his way for gaining my vote. Henry Clay. Oh wait, no. But, and this is very important to me, which of course this is kind of obvious considering the times that this election took place in. As a Northerner, he was one of the biggest opponents of and like vocal like detractors or whatever you want to say, one of the biggest vocal opponents of slavery across the entire country. Never owned slaves once. That is extremely appealing to me. Of course, as I mentioned in my previous videos, my number one biggest political issue, or the thing that matters the most to me, is civil rights, or like equality, pursuing equal justice for all, equality between everyone. I want every single person to be treated equally, regardless of, you know, ethnicity, religious beliefs, like romantic beliefs, whatever. Everyone is equal in my eyes. So, not owning slaves and being against it, even at this time, would have been extremely appealing to me. Henry Clay is definitely a more likable figure, a more unifying figure than John Quincy Adams is. But there are two big issues that I have with him. Number one, he is a little bit lack of experience, especially compared to John Quincy Adams. I actually think he would have made a good vice presidential candidate, which I definitely would have taken him over the person who actually did win, and who was running with John Quincy Adams, which was John C. Calhoun. Absolutely despise this man, but we're not talking about him here at this time. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House at this time, was actually voted when he took office, as you'll notice. He was actually voted as Speaker of the House, and he held that position for on and off roughly 13 years, which is very impressive. Prior to that, he was very briefly a senator from his home state of Kentucky, which is also very good. So this man has a ton of legislative experience right off the bat, and he would only get more and more as we get further down the line. You'll see that as we get there. But compared to John Quincy Adams, a little bit lackluster, considering that, you know, John Quincy Adams, I showed you all the diplomatic positions he held, Secretary of State. He was a senator as well too, so he has legislative experience. And number two, Clay was a slave owner. Not a big one as far as I'm aware. And he definitely wasn't like, you know, a super big vocal supporter of slavery, but he sure as hell did not go and make any big moves when it came to saying that slavery should have ended. Now, I know this is about 30 years or so, roughly, before the Civil War broke out, when that issue became mainstream. But again, my biggest issue is civil rights. So for me, my vote would have gone to John Quincy Adams in this election, and as it is a ticket, his running mate would have unfortunately been John C. Calhoun, the current Secretary of War from South Carolina. One of the most unlikable men in American history, honestly, where he was vice president to both John Quincy Adams, and then he would go and turn around and become vice president to Andrew Jackson in the following election, and then both of these men, including one who's a Southerner himself, would come to go and despise this man, with Andrew Jackson literally saying, and I quote, his only regret in office was that he didn't hang that son of a bitch Calhoun sooner when he had the chance. Jackson, I absolutely hate you, but I wholeheartedly agree. Maybe not flat out murder, but definitely something for Calhoun, because Calhoun sucks. So my vote would have gone to John Quincy Adams. So this slide right here is just to show off the map real quick. Of course, there was of course no person who ran this election who gained a majority of electoral votes or popular vote, even though Jackson technically did have the majority, but not the plurality, the one necessary. So it went to the House of Representatives. Adams forms an alliance with Henry Clay, who gets him the presidency with voting with these 13 states who vote Adams into the presidency, and then Adams turns around and makes Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Big bonus points when it comes to Clay's experience, but definitely does not make Adams look very good to the general public. Many people, of course, see it as a corrupt bargain, like you made a very terrible deal in order to get the highest office possible. Like if people didn't see Adams as an elitist before this time, he definitely was viewed as one after this. So, yes, the corrupt bargain is pretty bad, and yes, I would have been pretty upset at Adams for having done that. So right off the bat, Jackson comes up with a grassroots campaign, says, I'm coming back. I was stolen this election. I technically won the most electoral votes and the popular vote, yet I still didn't win the election because of the other two people who are running, denying me a majority. So he's coming back, and in 1828, we have ourselves a rematch with with Andrew Jackson, and the current incumbent president, John C. Calhoun, running against the incumbent president, John Quincy Adams, with his running mate, the current Secretary of the Treasury, Richard Rush. So, this is obviously a bit of a tough one. I would have been very upset, of course, like I mentioned, to John Quincy Adams with the corrupt bargain. And, of course, he also passes the Tariff of 1828 too, which is known as the Tariff of Abominations, the bill that broke records to, even to this day, the highest tariffs the United States has ever passed were underneath this administration. Adams continued to paint himself as elitist and out of touch. What did not go and, personally campaign like Jackson did. I mean, not nearly as much as people do today, but pretty much just stayed in the White House by himself and acted presidential, which is admirable, but definitely not a good strategy when looking for re-election. With that being said, there is no question in my mind as to who I would vote for in this election. I despise Andrew Jackson with a passion. So there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that I would not have wanted him in office whatsoever. So I would have reluctantly voted for John Quincy Adams a second time in this election. He just beats Jackson pretty much wholeheartedly when it comes to all of these. Obviously, experience-wise, character-wise, and platform. John Quincy Adams stood for infrastructure and building big construction projects to try and help out the economy. I like that. I think that's a good idea. He stood for a centralized United States observatory, a big canal, a Navy base and an Army base, a whole bunch of different things. I like that. I think that's a great idea. Jackson was what was known, of course, as the man of the people, if you will. He's common man can vote. I will be your bodyguard against the elitists. Which, that actually is pretty appealing, to be fair. And I probably would have liked something like that if it wasn't Andrew Jackson who was heading the ticket. So, for me, 1828 is not even a question. John Quincy Adams would have gotten my vote. Really do wish I could pause as I'm recording, but unfortunately there really isn't an option to do that, so just hold on for a moment. So, we move on to 1832. Now, 1832 is probably one of the most dullest elections for most people to look at because it was pretty much just landslide victory for the incumbent president Andrew Jackson to win with, and then there was three other opponents that kind of just were there, never had a chance at winning. Which, that is definitely a fair assessment when it comes to judging this election, and I can kind of agree with that. So, obviously, right off the bat, you can discredit Andrew Jackson, not voting for him. I would not have liked what he was doing in office, would not have liked the way that he was pretty much treating Washington as a playground for the common man. That's pretty terrible. His signing of the Indian Removal Act, I mean, look it up yourself. I don't even really have the heart to describe it. I do like that John C. Calhoun has ditched Jackson and has now been replaced by Martin Van Buren, who at this point had been Jackson's Secretary of State, had been his minister to Britain, even though the Senate never approved, and had been a senator from New York. So he is from, he probably would have been from what I would have considered my neck of the woods, which I like. But again, you're paired up with Jackson, so no shot in hell. We look over here at Henry Clay, who of course was former Secretary of State, of course was Speaker of the House for a while, would turn in and run for the Senate in Kentucky, pretty much was the anti-Jackson association, if you will. And then his running mate, I actually don't know all that much about, John Sargent. Let's go ahead and take a look at him real quick. Yeah, so John Sargent, House member from Pennsylvania, good ticket balancing there. An okay amount of experience in the House of Representatives for a little while, a couple of terms here and there. Not the best, but nothing too bad, especially when compared to, you know, the powerhouse that is Henry Clay. But this is actually the first time throughout this these elections that a third party, or two really, actually stand out, where we have William Wirt, the Attorney General, the longest serving Attorney General in American history, by the way, which most people probably do not know about, running on the anti-Masonic party, which was pretty much an anti-elitist party. You know, strongly opposed Freemasonry, was pretty much wanting to stick it towards what they viewed as elitist, which Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay were both kind of seen as at this time. So again, like I said, he was the Attorney General under James Monroe and John Quincy Adams. A lot of good experience there when it comes to judicial stuff, so he would definitely know law and order. That's good. His running mate is Amos Ellmaker, who I don't know much about. Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Pretty much a nobody, again. Kind of similar to Jared Ingersoll from 1812. Definitely not someone I would have been particularly inspired by. Amos Ellmaker would have been. And then we have John Floyd, as you can see here, who is part of this party called the Nullifier Party. He was governor of Virginia for a time. Yep. Was in the House of Representatives for a little while. So he has a good chunk of experience there, but he wasn't necessarily actually running for president. And as you can see here, this is a good explanation of it. Floyd did not appear on the ballot in any states that chose his electors via a popular vote. His electoral votes were awarded by the South Carolina state legislature. He's pretty much a candidate who's running against the nullification issue at this time, which is real fun, exciting stuff. That's also the reason why John C. Calhoun abandoned Andrew Jackson. It's pretty much South Carolina opposing tariffs that Andrew Jackson was more in support of. So this is South Carolina pretty much just going and saying F you to Andrew Jackson and going and giving their votes to this man John Floyd instead. So he is not technically a major contender in this election. So we are going to discount him. So we're focusing on William Wirt, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. William Wirt, I get his appeal. I think he would definitely have made a decent president, but my vote here would have gone to Henry Clay and his running mate John Sargent. Again, experience-wise, he wins hands down. And I just kind of feel like when it comes to like major parties versus third parties, I want to often vote for the person who has the best chance to win. And in my eyes, it would have been Henry Clay in this election. And of course, since it was a four-way race, you couldn't see the map. So here's a closer-up view of the map, even though I showed it on the Wikipedia page. All right, now for one of the most interesting elections in American history. This is quite the list of people here, as you can very clearly tell. So 1836 was pretty much Martin Van Buren, the incumbent vice president to Andrew Jackson, and his running mate, Richard Mentor Johnson, a senator and House member from Kentucky, I believe. Let me see. I'm pretty sure it was Kentucky. Yeah, from Kentucky. So a very good and experienced ticket right here right off the bat. But pretty much being seen as a continuation of Andrew Jackson's policies, running against 4 different candidates from the newly formed political party called the Whigs, WHIG, named after the Whigs of England back in the mid 1700s, if I'm not mistaken. So of these 4 Whig candidates, all of them were pretty much playing what is often called the favorite son movement, which is the basic idea is voters would vote for the person who represents their generalized area in the country. For example, Northerners voting for Northerners and Southerners voting for Southerners. So as you can see here, we have 4 candidates. So we have William Henry Harrison, who was known as another general from the War of 1812, held multiple different positions in government. He was governor of Indiana Territory for about 12 years at the beginning of the 1800s. He was a senator from Ohio, was a brief minister to Grand Columbia, which I believe is pretty much just, modern day Columbia, member of the House of Representatives. So a good chunk of experience there, a war hero, so would definitely be seen as an inspiring figure there. Problem with him, he has not held political office in like 8 years, so definitely out of touch when it comes to the American people. And he's 64 years old at this point, so a little bit on the older side, definitely not super appealing there. He's on the ballot on every single northern state. So at this time, let me go ahead and take a look at the map. It would have been, actually, we have ourselves a ballot right here. So William Henry Harrison was on the ballot in Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, even though that's a southern state, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, and that is it. So pretty much every single northern state, with the exception, of course, of Kentucky, which was a southern state, but that doesn't matter. Then you have Daniel Webster, who is definitely a very appealing candidate, very experienced, very level-headed. One of the most consequential and just well-voiced politicians of the 19th century in general. Definitely knew what he was doing, would have been a very darn good president had he ever been elected. Honestly, just so much experience, so much good character coming from it. Like, he would have taken the job extremely seriously, and I love that. And of the 5 people here, probably the second most experienced person behind Van Buren himself. And then you have Hugh Lawson White. Oh yeah, and then Daniel Webster is only on the ballot in Massachusetts. So that's a big factor that I'm going to be taking into effect. And of course, the running mate for these 2 northern men was Francis Granger. Now, the southern parts of the ticket, we have Hugh Lawson White from Tennessee, the senator from that state for many years. And then we have another southern senator, Willie Person Mangum, who was senator from South Carolina and was only on the ballot in that state. And Hugh Lawson White was on the ballot in every single southern state besides South Carolina. And their running mate was John Tyler, who was a southerner from Virginia. Francis Granger, I actually really don't know that much about either. I'll go ahead and take a look at him real quick. Excuse me. So he's from New York. A little bit of experience in the House, but he only had been in there for like a year and a half prior to this election, so not a lot of good experience there. John Tyler, on the other hand, a lot of good experience, of course. Governor of Virginia for about a term. Was in the House for several terms. Was a senator and also became the president pro tempore of the Senate. A lot of good experience there. But again, these two are Southerners. They are pro-slavery. They are pretty much everything that I would have absolutely despised when it came to presidential candidates. So, not voting for those two. I'm not going to vote for Van Buren, obviously, because he's a continuation of Andrew Jackson. Now, I know what I said regarding my 30-40-30 rule, and yes, he technically would have won with experience, but I would have despised him on his platform, so that would leave character for me. And the biggest character flaw that I have with Van Buren, aside from being pretty much a lackey of Jackson, is his pretty much just go on full support of the Indian Removal Act. So, not voting for Van Buren, too much associated with Jackson there. So that leaves Harrison and Webster. Now, under most normal circumstances, if I had known that Webster would have been on the ballot in multiple states, or in any state besides Massachusetts, I would have voted for Daniel Webster hands down in this election. But under the assumption that more than likely I probably would not be living in Massachusetts and I want to vote for the person who probably has the best chance of winning, my vote would have gone to William Henry Harrison reluctantly for this one. Kind of just the lessest of all the evils here. Not Southern, doesn't have major character flaws with the current administration, and is on the ballot in multiple states. But if I had it my way, I would have voted for Daniel Webster. But again, he was not on the ballot in a majority of northern states, so unfortunately, I would have to go with Harrison for this election. Now, Van Buren does win this election relatively closely. The Whigs, of course, ran the 4 different candidates. They wanted to try and deadlock the Electoral College and force the election into the House of Representatives. Of course, it didn't work. And Van Buren and Johnson get elected into the presidency and vice presidency, respectively. Richard Mentor Johnson is actually an extremely unpopular vice presidential candidate, though, and an elector actually refuses to vote for him. So that part of the presidential election gets tossed into the House of Representatives for them to choose a possible alternative, but they choose Johnson to be vice president anyway. But he's proven to be so unpopular, mostly because of him having an affair with one of his slaves that he owned. Yes, a white man owning slaves had an affair with one of his slaves. Kind of sounds similar to Thomas Jefferson, if you get my meaning, but we won't talk about that. Yeah, that paints Johnson as extremely unpopular. So we come to 1840. Martin Van Buren gets reelected by the Democratic Party, and Richard Mentor Johnson actually does not. And this is the only time in American history where there was no running mate for a major political party ticket. So by this time, Martin Van Buren is seen as a ginormous failure in office, mostly because of his handling of the Panic of 1837, which, to be fair to him, was not his fault why it happened. It was mostly because of Jackson's extreme vetoing for all these different bills that he was doing. His pretty much lack of spending for Congress, eliminating the National Bank. All those things led to this extremely terrible panic that happens in 1837, and Van Buren is able to do little to stop it or fix it. So in 1840, Van Buren is looking pretty terrible. Technically, yes, he would win on experience, but I would just think that this would be an easy no-brainer, voting for William Henry Harrison and his running mate John Tyler in this election, because, I mean, come on. Van Buren is extremely out of touch with what's going on with the American people at the time. Harrison is seen, of course, as that other man of the common people, but not nearly as controversial as Andrew Jackson. I think he would have made a damn good president, honestly, or at least decent enough for the time, and definitely would have led the country in a better direction than what Martin Van Buren would have had he been reelected. So, of course, William Henry Harrison is, of course, known as the president with the shortest tenure in office, dying after only 31 days in office, and John Tyler becomes the next president, the 10th president of the United States. And it's because of him that the next election has its primary issue, which is the annexation of Texas, essentially being known as what are we going to do with extra land that is going to be coming our way. So that would not have been that big of a deal until John Tyler pretty much supported the annexation of Texas. So that leaves everyone kind of in a bit of a crisis. Where do we stand on the Texas issue? So that leads us here into 1844, where we have the legendary senator, Secretary of State, you know Henry Clay by now, I've spoken to him about enough, versus a dark horse unknown candidate, James K. Polk. Before, of course, the convention, he was not well known at all. He was governor of Tennessee for 4 years prior to this, and he also was Speaker of the House right towards the end of Jackson's term and going into Van Buren's term. So this is actually the only election in American history where both major party candidates were former Speakers of the House, interestingly enough. So this election is interesting. This is actually in my top 5 hardest elections for me to decide on a candidate on who I would want to vote for. This one is very tricky for me because on one hand, both of them are extremely appealing in one way or another. Henry Clay for his experience, obviously. He wins the experience on the 30-40-30 hands down. It's not even close for me. And I also like that he is by this point known as what is called the Great Compromiser. He's known as this legendary figure in Congress, being able to get done pretty much almost anything and work across the aisle with Democrats and Whigs alike to get to pass a whole bunch of bills, which I love that. That is good. So he definitely has a lot of good, strong character when it comes to the presidency. The thing I don't like about Henry Clay is his kind of like reluctancy to really establish a firm position on the issue of Texas. He's like, nah, maybe we should, but no, we kind of shouldn't at the same time, which kind of paints him as a little bit out of touch, again, with the American people. That and this man is like 66 years old at this point. And I'm not the biggest fan of older candidates. They can be fine, but they have to really push themselves hard to earn a good vote from me in this one, majority of the time. So Henry Clay would have turned me off there, but he still is a very appealing candidate. James K. Polk, on the other hand, obviously does not win the experience ticket, but he is also actually a very dedicated individual when it comes to government jobs. He is known as a workaholic, both before and during his presidency. His platform would have also been extremely appealing to me as well, where he pretty much imbues the idea of manifest destiny. We need to expand our borders, become the biggest and best country we possibly can, go from sea to shining sea. We are owed everything in regards to the land, all this new land that we can get from Mexico. We need to get this new land that we can get from this new territory up in the Northwest called Oregon Territory, where we have to we can try and negotiate with the British to get all of this excess new land that we rightfully deserve and all these other things. Like, that is maybe today not a very appealing thing, like pretty much just going and seizing land. But at this point, that is actually a pretty appealing message that he's campaigning on, wanting us to be, the top dog when it comes to like the economy and just land size, and pretty much just on the world scale, making the United States even bigger and stronger than it already currently is. So this is actually a very, very close and very, very tough election for me. Because on one hand, I have a very experienced candidate who would have done a very good job as president, but seems kind of out of touch with modern issues, versus a person who I feel is not super experienced, might be a little bit heavy-handed on like his rhetoric on what he's saying, but is hitting the nail perfectly when it comes to his platform and the current issues of the day. And he's a younger guy too, so that also helps. And he does actually have decent experience. Yes, Clay beats him, but don't go and say that Polk doesn't have experience. Again, he was a governor and he was Speaker of the House. He's good when it comes to his experience. Now, of course, their running mates I'll very briefly touch upon too. Of course, George M. Dallas, very briefly was a senator for his home state of Pennsylvania for about 2 years. Was mayor of Philadelphia. He was a district attorney. Attorney General, of course, a little bit of diplomatic experience, minister to Russia, so a little bit of good experience here and there. Theodore Frelinghuysen, which was chosen to balance the ticket for Henry Clay, who was a Southerner, is from New Jersey, was a senator there for a little while, and also mayor of Newark, but has not been in political office, as you noticed, for 6 years. Mayor of Newark, I would argue George Dallas, even though I'm not the biggest fan of him as a person either, he was kind of an unlikable figure. Kind of really just thought of himself and nothing else. Probably would have won this election for me if this was a battle of which running mate was better. I would probably prefer George M. Dallas. But yeah, so this election is extremely close for me. I would have had a very, very hard time when it comes to picking a candidate here. Now, I know I mentioned before, too, Henry Clay was a slaveholder. James K. Polk was, too, though, so unfortunately there is no lesser of two evils to really go with here for this election. Now, I am aware in this election there actually was another candidate who was running in the northern part of the for the Whigs, and his name was James G. Birney. It was considered part of the Liberty Party, and again, he sucked out what is considered enough votes from the North away from Henry Clay to give James K. Polk the win. James Birney, not only is he a very inexperienced person, as you can very clearly tell right here, also a Southerner. He was an abolitionist, but at the same time, though, I just don't see enough of him to really be an extremely effective president or really an effective candidate. He was just kind of there. So this is really a question between Polk or Clay. Again, I went back and forth between this one in my head a lot. This one was very, very tricky for me, but at the end of the day, I would have voted for James K. Polk because I believe that his character being more in touch with the American citizens at the time, and just his platform, what he stood for, being the top dog, I think would have been more appealing to me than what I would have seen with Henry Clay, who I would have thought was a little bit too out of touch at this point. That and James K. Polk had a very good work ethic, very good work record as well too. So I wouldn't have been too disappointed with Polk over Clay. Now, if Clay would have won, I would have been okay with that. There's no problem that I have with Clay winning, but I would have gone with Polk for this one. All right, next we have 1848, where we have Democrat Lewis Cass versus Whig Zachary Taylor versus former President Martin Van Buren for the Free Soil Party. So Polk, of course, has been in office for 4 years. He has accomplished everything that he said he was going to do in his campaign promises. We went to war with Mexico and successfully won the war, and then got a ton of new land, modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado. And he negotiated a treaty with Britain to get us modern-day Oregon and Washington. He lowered the tariff. He established an independent treasury. So James K. Polk, and this will be a spoiler alert for later on when I do a ranking of all the presidents, which I will do at some point. James K. Polk is one of my personal favorite presidents, personally just because of everything he was able to get done, just how effective of a president he really was. I love that. It was maybe the way that he governed a little bit, especially in regards to the war with Mexico, was kind of shady, kind of founded on lies, which is true. but you cannot deny how effective it was and how he was able to get done all of that he said he was going to do in only one term, and promising not to run for re-election. So at this point, the Democrats are actually looking pretty decently appealing right now. So I'll start with Lewis Cass since he's on the left. His biggest appeal is pretty much riding on the coattails of the successes of James K. Polk. And his appeal is experience. So his experience is actually plentiful. He was, first of all, he's from Michigan. He was originally from Ohio. He was governor of the territory for like 17 years. Held a cabinet position in Andrew Jackson's administration as Secretary of War. Had a good diplomatic experience as ambassador to France, and was a senator. So he pretty much has all the good qualifications that you would need when it comes to being president. So when it comes to these three, well, Martin Van Buren, obviously, I would say actually probably wins with experience out of these three because former president here. But if Martin Van Buren was not in the picture, I would give the win for experience to Lewis Cass. Now, what I did not like about Lewis Cass, and this is pretty big, is what he stood for, which was popular sovereignty, which is pretty much the idea of now that we have all this new land, what are we going to do with it? I know, let's let everyone who lives in those areas vote for themselves and pretty much choose for themselves if it should be a slavery state or a free state. How could that possibly go wrong whatsoever? Oh, we can discuss that in a little bit. Those of you who know your history, though, can probably guess where I'm going with that. So yeah, popular sovereignty is definitely not a good thing. So him standing for that was absolutely terrible, and it would have turned me off against him completely. Now, as for character, I'll be honest, I don't really know a ton about Lewis Cass and his character, honestly. Obviously a good, skilled, hard worker. Obviously he wouldn't have gotten, all of the positions that he had, but again, he kind of just reminds me of another just out-of-touch individual with the mood of the country at the time. Wasn't really in the know with a lot of the issues, if you will, at the time. Which is a shame, too, because, again, I like a president with good experience, and he definitely would have been that. Moving on to Zachary Taylor. And William Orlando Butler. He was a general in the Mexican-American War, or not necessarily a war hero, but he served in the Mexican-American War, and was also briefly a member of the House of Representatives from, I believe he was from Kentucky as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, from Kentucky. Served there for 2 terms. Lived for a long time, too. Wow, dang. Also served in the War of 1812. Okay, and my apologies. He actually was a Major General. All right. I don't know everything about every single candidate on this list. I just do the best I can. That's why I have Wikipedia pulled up here. So definitely has the appeal. So you have the experience and you have the war hero. Now that's a good ticket. Not great, but pretty decent. And I forgot to mention Lewis Cass being from Michigan, so he's a northerner, but he kind of has more southern sympathies, if you will, than what kind of like the North really had. Again, especially when it comes to his idea of popular sovereignty. So he's one of several people who run for president during this time that is considered a doughface, a northerner with southern sympathies. Don't like them, don't like that at all. Lewis Cass, you're not looking extremely appealing right now. Now I look over here to Zachary Taylor, a Southern war hero from Louisiana. Never held elected office before. He had been in the military all his life. A very famous and effective war hero in the Mexican-American War. So definitely could be seen as appealing like that. But the biggest problems with Zachary Taylor, aside from his lack of experience, and that hurts him a ton in my book, is him just being extremely out of touch with pretty much anything. Like, even more out of touch than Lewis Cass. Never voted in a presidential election, No one even knew where he stood on political issues. He pretty much just declared himself a Whig because. So he was pretty much just replace Zachary Taylor with an empty chair, and you would pretty much have had Zachary Taylor, the candidate. It's pretty much just run an empty chair for office. It's pretty much identically the exact same thing. Oh yeah, but that chair somehow managed to win a lot of battles in a war that we just barely fought. Okay, cool. Yeah, Zachary Taylor, I am not voting for him. That, and he's also another slave owner from the South who, I mean, again, now I know I voted for Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, stuff like that, but we're getting closer and closer to the Civil War. We're getting closer and closer to, slavery being more and more by the day of a hot-centered issue, and even in this election it really was. So it was front and center here even more than before. So I'm not voting for Zachary Taylor, obviously. So then I look at Martin Van Buren over here. First and foremost, again, I mentioned he wins experience-wise because, again, he was a former president, former vice president, secretary of state, minister to Great Britain, senator, very briefly governor of New York. This man has a great resume. Of course, one could say that his presidency was terrible, which is also true. But at this point, he's not running for the Democrats. He's actually running for the Free Soil Party, which was an abolitionist party, pretty much saying for the, running for the abolition of slavery, stopping the spread of slavery out west. Do I need to explain why I find that extremely appealing and why that would win platform and character-wise? And he's also a northerner from New York. Again, I would have liked to have voted for him back in 1836 if he wasn't such a big lackey of Jackson, but now that Jackson is not only out of the picture, but is actually dead, Van Buren is actually a pretty good candidate for me in this one, honestly. And again, he was on the ballot in most northern states, wasn't in a lot of southern states. His running mate was Charles Francis Adams Sr., the son of John Quincy Adams. Did not have a lot of experience, but had good name recognition. And then, of course, Millard Fillmore was the running mate of Zachary Taylor. He was from New York as well. So I would have voted for Martin Van Buren in this election, which may surprise some people on this. But when it comes to me, Zachary Taylor would never have gotten my vote because of the lack of experience and just pretty much a lack of anything likable, honestly. And Lewis Cass, although having good experience, I don't like your platform, man. I don't like your Southern sympathies. That would have counted me out. Martin Van Buren checks all the boxes that I want from a candidate. Real quick about Millard Fillmore, because Zachary Taylor technically does win this election. Again, he was in the House for 3 terms. Was also chair of the House. He has a little bit of experience in Congress. And he was also the comptroller of New York, which is pretty much a person who's in charge of like finances and things like that. So not a ton of experience, not extremely that impressive for me, but definitely better than Zachary Taylor. But yeah, I would have voted for Martin Van Buren in 1848. And of course, this is a close-up of the election. Again, Taylor does win this election pretty closely. Both Cass and Taylor won 15 states. Taylor winning this election, I guess I would have been okay with over Lewis Cass. I think I probably would have preferred him over Lewis Cass. Maybe, maybe not. It's complicated. I really don't like Cass or Taylor at all. Both of them would have been terrible in my eyes. Even though Van Buren didn't get a single electoral vote, I would have voted for him anyway. So this is one of the few exceptions where I would not have voted for a major party candidate. So now we move on to 1852. Oh boy, this one is a messy one. So Taylor, of course, dies in office. Millard Fillmore takes over as president and supports one of the worst laws in American history, the Compromise of 1850, which it was pretty much seen as a last-ditch effort to really keep the country kind of holding on together when it was splitting apart over the issue of slavery. And to be fair, it worked until 1860, so it was drafted by Henry Clay, of course. I mean, it worked, but the Fugitive Slave Act, which pretty much meant for the anyone who saw an escaped slave, even if it was in a northern state, where they were technically free, could send them back to their, quote, masters, unquote, without any legal repercussion to the slave whatsoever. So, yeah, no, I would have been extremely against that, so that would have turned me off from Millard Fillmore, would have been pissed off about that. And I would have been looking for a change, someone who could very well stand up to slavery, someone who was willing to, rock the boat, because clearly no one is willing to do so. I get it's a divisive issue, but I don't know if I would have necessarily been like a huge abolition at this time in the likes of like John Brown, but I definitely would have been a vocal critic of it. So I look over at the Democrats. They've nominated Franklin Pierce, who is another compromise candidate similar to James K. Polk, because no one can really agree on the issue of slavery. So they nominate this guy from New Hampshire, was previously a member of the House of Representatives, was a member of the United States Senate back in like the mid-1830s and early 1840s, was a brigadier general in the Mexican-American War, but he's also a young guy too, at age like 49, I believe, so would have been one of the youngest presidents elected at this time. And his running mate is William R. King, pretty much the opposite of Pierce in every way. Pierce, where he lacked experience because he only had one term in the Senate and only like 2 terms in the House, William King had been in the Senate for decades. Huge influence with there. And oops, clicked on his picture. So yeah, he was in the House for a couple terms, Minister to France under John Tyler and James Polk, was a senator for 3 decades, and then again here, President pro tempore. Like, this man has so much experience, it's insane. So that's great, especially when you look at Franklin Pierce, who, again, pretty lacking. Again, he had a couple state offices, was in the House for 2 terms, Senate for 1 term. Not that impressive to me. He was actually a pretty likable individual, believe it or not. Considered one of the most social presidents in American history, or just candidates in general. Pretty much everyone liked him. I am willing to believe I probably would have as well. So when it comes to character, this is a rare one where the person who wins character for me probably does not have the best chance at getting my vote, because Pierce was actually a pretty likable guy. And I like that. I would like more people like Pierce to, personality-wise, to probably get the presidency, at least when it comes to like their, how they appear to others. What I do not like about Pierce is his lack of experience, although we'll get to Winfield Scott in just a moment. I do not like his lack of experience and his platform, which was he was another doughface, Northerner with Southern sympathies. Pretty much is like, yeah, I don't really like slavery, but there's not too much to be done about it. He was just kind of like standing there, not really giving much of any big time solution to the problem. So I don't like Franklin Pierce, but he might be the better candidate compared to his opponent, which was Winfield Scott. Now, Winfield Scott, again, is another war hero, just like Taylor. Spent his entire life in the military, more than 40 years. Fought in the War of 1812, was like commanding general of the entire army, was like only a couple of individuals have ever gotten. So decently appealing. The problems with him, obviously no experience in office whatsoever, so that turns me off. He was also known as a pretty out-of-touch individual as well, too, when it comes to issues. Not the easiest person to get along with. Kind of an outspoken man as well, too. Although it is said that a lot of his troops really did like him, and he was very good on the battlefield, very effective as a leader, which is good, but how much of that would we really have known up until, historians who are really digging into his past. So, Character definitely would not have been as likable as Pierce. Experience loses to Pierce. Platform, um, pretty much just saying the exact same things what Millard Fillmore would have done. Pretty much just kicking that can down the road, offering no real solutions to anything whatsoever. So, not really a fan of Scott whatsoever in this selection. Of course, his running mate is William A. Graham, who was also a Southerner. He was Secretary of the Navy under the Fillmore administration from North Carolina, governor of that state and a senator, so a decent amount of experience there. Definitely a good contrast to Winfield Scott, but Scott is just not very appealing to me. And it was actually his lack of decisiveness that pretty much splintered the Whig Party and actually makes him the last Whig candidate to ever run for president. And wow, you guys really went out with a bang, didn't you? So I would have been leaning towards Pierce, unfortunately, for this one, just because Scott is just not appealing to me whatsoever, and at least Pierce is a likable guy. But then I look over here, and here's another Free Soil Party candidate, John P. Hale, who did not actually make the center thumbnail here for the 1852 presidential election. And I might be stretching it a tiny bit when including him, because out of technicality, he actually only got 4.9% of the popular vote, but the hell with it. He was a major enough candidate. He was on the ballot in pretty much every single northern state. The only one he wasn't on was Virginia, Tennessee, Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Missouri, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Arkansas, and Alabama. So all southern states he wasn't on, but he was on the ballot in all northern states. So I would have seen him. He would have been there. Again, he got 5% of the popular vote, pretty much. Again, he was like 0.10% away from it. So I'm willing to count him for this. And he would also be the one to get my vote, too. And the reason why, even though I don't think his character probably would have been as necessarily good as Pierce's, because he's not necessarily as likable of an individual per se, he does hold, by far, the most experience out of these three individuals. Let me go ahead and show you. Member of the House, he was from New Hampshire as well. Only one term there. Was in the Senate for a good chunk of time and is here as well, too. In office a lot more recently than what Pierce was. So experience-wise, I give the points to Hale. Oops, that's 1848. Character-wise, he was non-apologetic when it comes to telling people what he felt and what he believed was right. And I admire that from a person who has, not necessarily no filter, but, doesn't sugarcoat things, doesn't dance around the subject, just tells you straightforward how it is. And John P. Hale had that reputation in the Senate. I love that. I think that's extremely admirable. That is a good quality trait that I like to look for in presidents. Of course, there is such a thing as being too stubborn, and maybe Hale was that a little bit, but for me, he more than makes up for it with being a person who was, for the Free Soil Party. Was unapologetically against slavery and unapologetically would have opposed, the expansion of slavery out west. A very effective legislator who had a good chunk of experience, not as much as I would have liked, but still good enough for this, especially considering his other opponents. Was in office most recently at the time, and yes, I know Pierce was technically in there for longer, but he hadn't been in there for 10 years when Hale was an incumbent senator. And I would have been full on board with his platform for getting rid of slavery, his good chunk of experience that he had, and just his unapologetic character for something he truly believed in that was right. And of course, his running mate was George Washington Julian. No relation, of course, to George Washington himself. Was a representative from Indiana. Don't really know much about him, but at least he was a northerner who definitely balanced the ticket well. So, yeah, my vote in 1852 would have gone to John P. Hale, because I don't like Winfield Scott at all, and Franklin Pierce's Southern sympathies just wouldn't have done it for me. And of course, here is the electoral map. Pierce absolutely dominated this election, mostly because the Whigs couldn't really get on board with anything. So Pierce wins this election and has an extremely controversial presidency. So much so he remains the only presidential candidate in American history as of this recording to literally be denied like the chance at renomination by his party. He was so divisive of a figure. And that is mostly because instead of helping with the helping to mend the country and fix the issue of slavery, he left it even more further divided than when he came into office, mostly because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was pretty much taking the idea of popular sovereignty and applying it to the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska, which eventually led to a literal shootout and tons of bloodshed happening there. It became known as Bleeding Kansas. So the Democrats are definitely looking very poor, very not in good shape. So their convention is pretty lackluster, and they nominate James Buchanan, a man who's actually would easily, of these three candidates that you see on the screen here, him, John C. Fremont, and Millard Fillmore, easily wins experience-wise. And it's not even close. Look at this. Was in the House for 10 years and was chair of a committee, has diplomatic experience, minister to Russia under the Jackson administration, was senator for another 10 years, was secretary of state under James K. Polk, and was minister to the UK under the Pierce administration. So plenty of legislative experience, good diplomatic experience, was on the cabinet. One of the most qualified men to ever run for president. Probably one of the very last ones we've ever had too. An extremely experienced individual. Biggest problems with him, obviously his age. He's 65 years old. Definitely should have won the nomination earlier than what he did. And was also not a very likable person. Kind of a pompous individual who was also pretty difficult to get along with. By pretty much almost everyone. Andrew Jackson did not like him, even though he offered him a role in his administration, which is kind of ironic. And he is also a doughface, northerner with southern sympathies. He's from Pennsylvania, but he has southern sympathies. Does not say, I don't really have a solution to the slavery issue. It's protected by the Constitution. I can't really do anything with it. I don't like it, but I can't really help you with it. And his running mate is John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. A lot of Kentucky running mates this time, I'm really starting to now notice. His only experience is 2 terms in the House, but a good contrast to the very old Buchanan, as he is and remains the youngest vice president in American history at only 36 years old. That is decently appealing, but again, a Southerner, something I would not have supported that much. So James Buchanan, despite winning the experience, 30% hands down, is extremely lackluster when it comes to character and platform, especially platform. So I look over here and I see John C. Fremont, who definitely is not the most experienced candidate in the world. The only thing that he really was prior to this, he's from California. Only thing he was a senator from California, and then before that, a shadow senator, whatever in the hell that means, for about, you can do the math, not even 2 years. Military governor of California, so he is a military man, so that's always good to see. Became a major general later in the Civil War, of course. But before that, though, he was actually an explorer, going and exploring out west during the days of the gold rush. In the mid-1850s, so could very well be qualified, if you would ever watch a documentary of world's most interesting man, John C. Fremont definitely would fit the bill for that. So definitely has a lot of good fun stories, a pretty appealing candidate just for his I guess life experience rather than political experience. And he is also fairly unapologetic when it comes to abolition of slavery out west. So again, platform wins for me. Definitely more in touch with issues of the American people at the time than Buchanan was. And I mean, just look at this beard. That's an awesome beard. His running mate was William L. Dayton. Not a super experienced candidate, but was a Northerner. Was senator from New Jersey. Had not been in office for 5 years. Definitely not super impressive in my eyes, but I mean, hey, you got to get something somewhere. I would have been extremely against the Democrats, of course, in this election, which would have led me to vote for John C. Fremont, even though I do like experienced candidates. But I would have been so against everything that Buchanan stood for and, you know, just his personality in general, that I would have voted for Fremont because slavery. Let's get it out of here, please. And of course, there's Millard Fillmore over here too, the former president, of course. Maybe you could qualify, and he has good experience too, even though I'd argue Buchanan beats him there. Yes, he was a former president, but he was nominated by the American Party, the Know Nothing Party, otherwise known as the Nativist Party, which Fillmore was not a nativist. He did not even necessarily want this nomination, being out of the country in Europe touring at the time that he was given the nomination against his will. Kind of just went for it. Didn't really stand for anything aside from America first, being, you know, everything that doesn't have to do with America itself can go F itself, pretty much. And his running mate was Andrew Jackson Donaldson, the nephew of Andrew Jackson. No real experience there. Just nothing about Fillmore here is appealing to me, even though he did receive 8 electoral votes in Maryland. So Buchanan does win this election, even though he does lose 2 of the most populous states. But he does win, and I would have been pretty disappointed in that. But hopefully Buchanan can do a good job as president, right? Yeah, no, definitely not. Definitely not indeed. So we move on to 1860. I'm just going to tell you right up front, I'm going to vote for Abraham Lincoln this election. I don't think that will come as much of a surprise, but let's talk about this real quick. Abraham Lincoln is the unapologetic person who, without saying that they want to abolish slavery, says that they want to keep the Union together, stop the expansion of slavery out west even more so than before, and it's just an amazing speaker. I mean, obviously you can read his speeches during his presidency, but even before that, I would go and believe that he was one of the most in-tune people with issues of the United States than almost any other political candidate in American history. And again, it's not even really close. Experience-wise, one of the least experienced candidates ever to run for president. The only thing that he had was 1 term in the House of Representatives representing Illinois back in the late 1840s, and he hadn't been in office for 11 years. 1 term in the House. That's it. His running mate, Hannibal Hamlin, was from Maine, was briefly governor of Maine, but was in the House and represented the Senate from Maine. Was actually in the Senate for quite a while, actually, and the House for 2 terms as well, too. So very, very great experience there. Was also a former Democrat, so that kind of leaned more towards like bipartisanship. Switched his political, you know, association from one party to the other because he recognized just how terrible the Democrats were really becoming when it came to the issue of slavery. So this is a very strong ticket. Even though Lincoln lacks experience, he makes up for it, especially with his platform and just his amazing character and speaking skills. Extremely in touch with the American people. Definitely knew what he was talking about, and I greatly appreciate that. His opponents, the Northern Democratic Party, nominated Stephen Douglas. Definitely has more experience than Lincoln, and probably would have been the next best runner-up. Had Lincoln not been in the race, I probably would have voted for Douglas. Experience-wise, again, very qualified individual. One of the very few people who actually has experience in all 3 branches of government. Executive, of course, Secretary of State of Illinois. He was also a justice in the Illinois Supreme Court, 2 terms in the House of Representatives, and had been in the Senate for 13 years prior. So a lot of good experience there. He was pretty much running on the idea of well, I don't really have much of a plan of solution, but we can continue to keep the country together. Yeah, even though he was a damn good speaker, again, look at the Lincoln Douglas debates, which is what put Lincoln in the spotlight to begin with. Um, I kind of just feel like his real lack of decisiveness on what solutions he could give for issues painted him as pretty out of touch, even though he was a relatively young man at the time. And yes, his platform and his character were just kind of lackluster. Again, he did have decent character for sure, which is why I would have voted for him as a runner-up if Lincoln was not in the election. But at the end of the day, though, here there was just really nothing that he stood for that painted him as in touch compared to Lincoln or really any other opponents at the time. His running mate was Herschel Johnson, the governor of Georgia. The Northern Democratic Party's last-ditch effort to try and, like, combine both sides of the country, even though it clearly wasn't going to work. And then you have John C. Breckinridge, who was running for the southern wing of the Democratic Party. The Democrats have split off so badly at this point. There's a northern wing and a southern wing. Incumbent vice president, decent experience, a pretty charismatic figure, but I mean, I think it wouldn't come as any surprise to say there's no way in hell I'm voting for him because he's a pretty rotten human being, and what he stood for was not what was needed at the time. His running mate, of course, Joseph Lane, was a senator from the new state of Oregon. He was governor of that territory for a while, was a member of the House of Representatives. Good experience there, too, but nothing excites me about this ticket. And then there's John Bell, who also is not a very exciting candidate either. Also very out of touch with the American people. Didn't really offer any solutions at all to the slavery issue, and was pretty much just campaigning on the Constitution as it is, as we currently have it. He was a member of the Constitutional Union Party, whatever in the hell kind of party that's supposed to be. Also the oldest of these four, and the last real major party candidate we ever had who was born in the 1700s, born in 1796. Good chunk of experience here, too. He was in the House. He was a Speaker of the House, too, for a little while, even though that was like more than 2 decades prior to this point. He was Secretary of War very briefly in the Harrison and Tyler administration, and he had been a senator for a while afterwards, too. So good chunk of experience, but pretty boring. Not a good speaker, not really well connected with anyone in the public. And what did he really stand for? Like, nothing. He was a Southerner as well, too. Again, there's just nothing I'm really working with here. He's from Tennessee, of course, but just not that interesting. And then Edward Everett, who was, of course, a former Secretary of State to Millard Fillmore, was a senator from Massachusetts, so he's a Northerner, Minister of the United Kingdom. Another good chunk of experience. So there's a lot of good experienced people here, and I'm voting for the one who has the least experience. But when it comes to me, just the most charismatic speaker out of all of them, and he has the platform that I agree with the most. When it comes to the rest of them, I know platform technically is equal to experience for me, but there are certain exceptions, and when it's this glaring big of an issue, I don't think it should be too much of a surprise that I'd vote for Lincoln in this election. And of course here, Lincoln wins, Civil War begins. We move on to 4 very long years later, to where Lincoln is running for re-election, the first president to do so since Martin Van Buren 24 years prior, and actually the first president to win re-election since Andrew Jackson, more than 30 years prior to this, which is kind of cool. So let's go ahead and compare the two candidates. We have the current president, Abraham Lincoln. I think his reputation is pretty well known now, so I don't really need to go and discuss what he's done and what he's doing and things like that. Long story short, I would have been extremely supportive of Lincoln throughout this election. His running mate is Andrew Johnson, a Democrat senator from Tennessee who was actually placed in control as the military governor of Tennessee. An actually pretty experienced candidate, even though he's also a Southerner and also a very unlikable person that I don't think I would have liked if I had ever met him personally. One of the biggest egos in American history. Yes, he was the next president, of course. But assuming I was alive in 1864 and had no idea, what was going to happen after Lincoln got reelected or whatever, and what Johnson would have done, I wouldn't have liked Johnson, but I would have gotten why he was on the ticket. It's a show of, of a bipartisanship that Lincoln's not a Republican. He's part of this National Union Party. We're trying to work across the fence and bring Democrats along. And there's no better choice for a Democratic running mate than the only Southern Democrat who stuck with the Union at the time, which it makes sense why he picked Johnson. I wouldn't have liked Johnson. Johnson, again, rotten human being. But again, this is kind of more so knowing now after his presidency versus then. I wouldn't have liked the idea of a Democrat being on the ticket, but I would have gotten why he was on there. Looking at Lincoln's opponent, George B. McClellan, his reputation today is known as being a general under the Lincoln administration very briefly during the beginning portions of the Civil War, who was later fired due to incompetence. Never held political office prior to this election. I don't really know too much of his personal character, although I have heard stories before that his troops that were under his command actually really liked him, so apparently he was a good commander, but he was a little bit too reckless and was definitely not a very good general, so a terrible leader. Also stood for continuing the war efforts, even though Lincoln was wanting to stop it, which did not really make much sense at all. And his running mate, George H. Pendleton, I actually really don't know that much about, honestly. Let's go ahead and take a peek at him. From Ohio, member of the House of Representatives. I believe he was a war Democrat, if I remember correctly, which means he wanted to continue to fight the war. McClellan was kind of in that similar boat. I don't remember exactly, but I mean, there's no surprise here that I would have voted Abraham Lincoln for re-election. He wins on, all three, hands down. All three of the, things I look for in a president. Has the experience, he's the current president. His character, I mean, do I need to explain? Come on. It's Abraham Lincoln we're talking about. And his platform, again, it's Abraham Lincoln. It's the most popular president in American history. If I need to go and explain what he stood for, I think we're kind of doomed. So 1868 comes around. Andrew Johnson, of course, is the current president after Lincoln's assassinated. He is, in my opinion, the worst president in American history. I don't really want to go and explain in this video exactly why I despise him so much. There's a ton of reasons. But the biggest one right now, Johnson's reputation is in disgrace, as is pretty much the Democrats at this point in time, mostly because of Johnson wanting to rush Reconstruction. Is impeached, acquitted by only one vote. Of course, vetoed the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Like, I despise Johnson, okay? But this is not about Johnson. This is about Ulysses S. Grant, the Republican, versus Horatio Seymour, the Democratic nominee. So, let's go ahead. This is one of those elections where I want to go and refer back to my 30-40-30, because this really explains the reason to why I vote the way that I do in this election. So, starting off with experience versus these two, Ulysses S. Grant is a war hero. He spent a majority of his life in the military and doing other excess jobs here and there. Has never held public office before, with the quote exception unquote of briefly being the acting Secretary of War under Andrew Johnson, but that's not really that much experience in government, so he doesn't really have experience. Horatio Seymour is a former governor of New York, had previously served in the early 1860s when the war was big and going on and about, and prior to that, one term in the 1850s. So when it comes to experience, Horatio Seymour wins here, like hands down. There's no doubt in my mind. And I personally am not really a big fan, as you've currently noticed, of voting in war heroes into office, with the exception of Washington, of course. I didn't vote for Taylor. I didn't vote for Winfield Scott. There's a couple other war heroes that will pop up on this list that I'm not going to vote for. Just a bit of a spoiler right there for you. But so when it comes to this, Grant is kind of lacking when it comes to experience, and I think Horatio Seymour probably would look better from that aspect alone. With that being said, Grant beats Seymour in pretty much every other aspect of this contest period. One of the most just genuine, likable, and just one of the most beautiful souls in American history to ever hold the presidency. Like, this man was so genuine, so extremely likable. Grant wins pretty much every other portion that I'm looking for here. Again, one of my personal favorite presidents. I'll admit out loud right off the bat. One of the bestest human beings to ever serve in the office. Extremely likable person. Went out of his way to try and be generally likable and get along with everyone across the board, Democrat, Republican alike. It doesn't matter who. And just like, again, so much integrity, so much just generosity and good feelings that come with him. His character is one of the best, I think, of any major candidate that has ever been nominated in American history. And as for his platform, I don't think it should come as too much of a surprise, considering what the Democrats were were doing during this time with Johnson. Seymour was pretty much just preserve the Union as it is right now. Things are okay as it is. We'll just continue to do things as Johnson has put on there. Versus Grant, who wanted to expand Reconstruction, and as he clearly saw that Johnson was making a disgrace of Reconstruction, expand civil rights and just rights in general for African Americans, and yeah, pretty much just to me represented the biggest issue that I look for in politics, and passed pretty much every single aspect that I would look for in a major, political party candidate to that issue with flying colors. His running mate was Schuyler Colfax, Speaker of the House at the time. Seymour's running mate was Francis P. Blair Jr., who was actually really known for being a pretty racist individual and speaking off the cuff many times. He's from Missouri, so he's a Southerner. Speaking off the cuff many times with pretty cringy and terrible comments that did not help Seymour whatsoever. One thing that I often hear about Seymour is he was actually a pretty reluctant candidate. He did not want to run for the office at all and just took it after many people continued to pressure him to do so. I mean, appealing, yes, but I'm sorry. When you stand for anything that Johnson did, even at all, you're going to turn me off. So my vote goes to Ulysses S. Grant in 1868. Moving on to 1872, we have the incumbent, Ulysses S. Grant, running for a second term against a very interesting candidate. This is actually not a Democrat. It is a liberal Republican who the liberal Republicans were opposed to a lot of Grant's policies during his first term. They thought he leaned a little bit too conservative. They thought that Grant was pretty corrupt, which, to be fair, his administration was pretty decently corrupt, even by this point in time. So the Democrats, rather than nominate their own candidate, actually joined forces with the liberal Republicans and endorsed this man right here, Horace Greeley, for president, who was known as a journalist, editor of the New York Tribune, the most popular newspaper in the country at the time, and also very briefly known as holding a seat in the House of Representatives from New York very briefly back in the 1840s, like 3 months, and that was like almost 30 years prior. So yeah, no experience coming from him. Very fascinating figure, though. Again, as a journalist, pretty much all of his beliefs and his platform, his character, everything was on full display for everyone to read and pretty much tear apart and nitpick. Um, he was he read Marx. He was a spiritualist, like communicated with the dead, vegetarian, very radical figure for his time, or at least what was seen as a radical at the time. But even though he would have, definitely liked the Reconstruction policies and would have wanted to continue it, even though he thought that Grant wasn't carrying them out that well, my vote here still easily would have gone to Ulysses S. Grant. He has the experience necessary. He wins character-wise, because I think Horace Greeley was a little bit too on the strange side for me. And, I mean, Grant was already doing a good job. He already had done everything that I would have wanted him to do for civil rights and was continuing to do so. He had, prosecuted and eliminated the Ku Klux Klan. Or if it wasn't in his first term, it was in his second. I can't remember, but he was definitely starting for it. Pushing big time for civil rights. Started creating for like conservation efforts. Created Yellowstone National Park. I don't remember if that was first term or second term. But if it wasn't in his first term, he was definitely pushing for it and would have continued to do so into his second term. Just Grant wins hands down every single trait that I look for as for like a voter. Like he check marks all three of my boxes in this. Has the experience needed. Definitely wins character, and I support his platform, so I have no reason not to vote for him. Now again, yes, his corruption this is during the time, of course, when the Republican Party was splitting into two different factions, or beginning to. The stalwarts, who believed in the spoil system. Party loyalty gets you jobs. You're loyal to certain people, and you can you play the political game, and you can get good, comfy jobs. Versus the half-breeds, which believed in giving government jobs on merit and those who are qualified, rather than your lackeys who you're paying out of your pocket to be loyal to you. There was a scandal that was well known under the Grant administration called the Credit Mobilier Scandal. His vice president at the time, Schuyler Colfax, was actually implemented for having been involved with the scandal. So that and Colfax attempted to try and run against Grant when Colfax assumed that Grant would not run for re-election. And then when Grant announced he actually was, Colfax tried to backtrack and say, "Oh yeah, I'll be your running mate again," when he looked kind of disingenuous for doing so. So they booted him from the ticket and replaced him with Henry Wilson, a Republican senator from Massachusetts. And then Horace Greeley's running mate, of course, Benjamin Gratz Brown, a Democratic governor from Missouri. Doesn't have that much experience either. This ticket is just great. Henry Wilson is a radical Republican, strongly in favor of, civil rights and Reconstruction, things like that, and I would have been all on board for that stuff. So yeah, my vote in 1872 would have gone to Grant. Now we make it to 1876. This is another one of those elections that would have been extremely, extremely, extremely difficult for me to have chosen a candidate for, just like 1844. This is again in my top 5 hardest elections to make a decision on. For most people, I think it would have been cut and dry, but for me, because of the issues that I take very seriously and are personally extremely important to me, it makes things complicated. So let's go ahead and break this down candidate by candidate. So Republicans nominate, the Republicans have the incumbent president, Ulysses S. Grant, in office. And he has passed a lot more legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and other things like that to help out with civil rights. But by this point, Reconstruction is being seen as a toll on the economy, being seen as very expensive, and not really working out as well as it could. So Reconstruction is not very popular in the general public's eye as what it once was, even to Northerners. That and Grant's corruption was becoming even more well known now. It seemed like every year or two there was another scandal or 10 that popped up. Like the whiskey ring the whiskey ring scandal. Again, I already mentioned Credit Mobilier, several others. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. But long story short, Grant is seen as a very corrupt and kind of unpopular individual. So the Republicans, careful to disassociate themselves with the now unpopular Grant, who I actually still would have liked, even despite the fact he was pretty corrupt, and that is not very a good image for him. Go ahead and nominate the reformist governor of Ohio. This is Ohio. Rutherford B. Hayes, with a running mate William A. Wheeler, a representative from New York. Hayes, of course, is known as a reformer, has decent experience in Ohio politics, was actually governor of Ohio twice, was elected in the 1860s, retired and then came back in 1876, was elected in 1875, and before that was also a member of the House of Representatives for one term, was also a Civil War general, similar to Ulysses S. Grant. So the experience is there, and I like that. Stands for, of course, continuing Reconstruction, but at the same time, though, cannot really escape too much from associating himself very heavily with the incumbent Ulysses S. Grant, who, again, the corruption was so well known and so disliked that I think any reasonable person would have not have supported the Republicans for that. So, yes, corruption is a very big issue, and I do wholeheartedly agree that that would have been a big turnoff for me for the Republicans. So I look over here on the other side, and the Democrats have nominated the New York governor Samuel J. Tilden and his running mate Thomas A. Hendricks, governor of Indiana, previously also a senator and a House representative member from there. So this is a very strong ticket. Two governors here, another governor on this side. Samuel J. Tilden is well known for standing up against the most corrupt political machine in New York called Tammany Hall, and pretty much went and eliminated them, stood up to them in a time when no one else was willing to do so, and was just seen as pretty much anti-corruption in every way possible. So that would have been extremely appealing for a majority of candidates at this time. For a majority of the American public at this time, which also explains it when you look at the election results of this one too. Tilden won the popular vote and was only one electoral vote away from winning. So this election is very close for me, again, as I mentioned. So the background being given out of the way, let's go ahead and look at the three criteria that I have. First, experience. I actually give the win to Rutherford Hayes because he has a little more experience in Ohio politics and was governor longer. Yes, I know that Samuel Tilden was governor of a bigger state, even though not necessarily for as long as Hayes was, and he worked his way up the political ladder. But again, just more years experience go to Hayes. He just is a little bit more, ready for the job, I would say, than Tilden is. That's just me. Character. Very difficult to establish here, honestly. Hayes is actually a very well-liked individual, known to get along with pretty much everyone, kind of similar to Pierce, a very social president, if you will, too. Doesn't really hold grudges much of anyone. He's known as being a pretty cheerful and fun individual and whatnot. And again, he's a reformer, too. Not as well known as Tilden, of course. But I still think he's pretty likable, so his character is good and definitely up there. Tilden, on the other hand, is also a pretty likable individual too. Very humble, very down to earth, and genuine. Again, his idea of standing up to political corruption makes him very in tune with the American public, and he has a very good, strong moral compass with things. So these two are pretty much tied for me when it comes to character. Hayes might edge out Tilden on certain issues, but I would say he's also a bit too out of touch with certain issues versus another, which might make him seem a little bit disingenuous compared to Tilden. So I would say these two are kind of neck and neck when it comes to character for me. They are both great, great solid choices, even if a lot of people in today's history don't really like Hayes or what he did during the presidency, but this is before we knew what would happen. And finally, we get down to platform, and again, it's very, very tough for me. We have anti-corruption over here versus not necessarily as much anti-corruption over here, but a continuation of civil rights and Reconstruction as much as possible over here. The Democrats would have ended Reconstruction. I know Hayes is known for ending Reconstruction, and that's because of, the electoral shenanigans that happened after this. But I would not have known that. In 1876, I'm pretending like I have no idea what would have happened prior to, the electoral count. And I am voting for what candidate most appeases to me. So if I was, living in the Northeast at the time, Samuel J. Tilden being from up there also would have been extremely appealing, and I would have liked that as well, too. So for me, this choice really comes down to which issue is more important to me, especially in the context of the times. Corruption in government or equal justice for all, like continuing of Reconstruction, civil rights, and stuff like that. Hayes, yes, technically again does win the experience card, but Tilden is kind of more from what I would assume would have been my neck of the woods over here. So again, extremely appealing for both reasons. So this election, I have gone back and forth with many times too, just like 1844. But for me, civil rights would have won the day, and I would have voted for Rutherford B. Hayes. It would have been very tough, very, very tough. But the idea of ending Reconstruction, I think for me, would have been a little bit too difficult of a pill for me to swallow at this time. So I would have probably sucked it up and voted for Hayes for this election. Now, of course, the results of this election are absolutely insane. The Compromise of 1877 happens, and as a result, Reconstruction is out. I would have been extremely upset at how close this election was, and even though I did vote for Hayes and would have been happy he won, I would not have been happy for the circumstances of which he did win. And I would have been like, okay, Republicans, you are a big turnoff towards me, and that probably would have been one of the biggest final straws for me when it comes to the idea of, political corruption, and it would have probably turned me off against the Republicans big time at this time. So would I have been upset that Tilden lost? If he had won, I would have been a little disappointed, but I would have at least wanted to have been done legitimately. And the way that the Compromise of 1877 happened, and Hayes essentially being forced to end Reconstruction anyway, would have been like, yeah, no, I would have been extremely upset at Republicans. I still probably would have supported Hayes overall. I still think he's a good person, good individual, relatively experienced guy to hold the office. But again, Tilden won this election. I think almost anyone can agree that eliminate pretty much anything else, any other chicanery that happened during this election, Tilden won. It would have been something I would have had to accept, but it wouldn't have been the end of the world. But the way that Hayes won here was definitely anything but acceptable for me. So now we move on to 1880. Hayes had a pretty rough term as president, of course. Again, it was mostly the Compromise of 1877 that really haunts him for it. So this election right here, I definitely would have been probably leaning more towards the Democrats than the Republicans, if anything else. But the problem here is the person who they decided to nominate for this election, which was Winfield Scott Hancock. They nominated him. He's from Pennsylvania. He is a Civil War hero, never held political office before. So when we do that compared to his Republican opponent, James A. Garfield, who was in the House of Representatives for like 17 years prior to this election, he loses when it comes to experience easily. However, I would still be willing to forgive that and overlook it if he won platform and character, and boy howdy does he not. Talk about boring, uninspiring, like big bucket of nothing. Just there was nothing here for me to work with. I don't necessarily think he was a horrible person, but I do think he was just boring and just not really anything I would want to have associated with the office of the presidency. And it doesn't help that his running mate, William Hayden English, was a representative from Indiana almost 20 years prior to this. So he also too has like next to no experience. So this ticket is extremely weak. There's nothing here that I really like that is inspiring to me. I get the the war hero that supports the Union and whatnot. I get the appeal of that, but just lack of experience, boring, definitely would not have done really anything significant in office. Turns me off from Winfield Scott Hancock. I look over here at James A. Garfield, on the other hand. Not only does he win experience-wise, like by far, but he was an extremely intelligent president. Again, the only ordained minister we've ever had as president, believe it or not. Was a teacher, college professor, very skilled politician, also a Civil War general as well too. So if you want to make the argument that he did not have the military credentials, oh no, he did. He was only in office. I mean, he was only on the battlefield for 2 years too, and he was a major general from Ohio. So another good area right there. This is the Ohio era of presidents. And amazing beard, just like, of course, Rutherford B. Hayes. Forgot to mention the beard. Freaking best beard any politician has ever had. Although James A. Garfield is definitely also there, but that's not a factor when it comes to picking presidents. Garfield is, of course, known for being the president assassinated in office, the second one assassinated in office. Excuse me. So we don't really know how far he really would have gone with this, but he also was a big supporter of civil rights as well too, and wanted to try and be a little bit more aggressive, even despite Reconstruction having ended. That would have been extremely appealing to me as well. I admire his intelligence. I admire the fact that he would have been willing to stand up for civil rights again, even when it probably would have been extremely unpopular for him to do so, and he just has more experience. So James A. Garfield wins my vote in a landslide in this election. I would have been against the Republicans for sure, but the fact that you guys just nominated such a great candidate here, and Hancock is just sort of nothing candidate, is just night and day. Garfield would win my vote here. Let's just say Arthur is his running mate. I do not like Arthur at all. Garfield is known as kind of somewhat of a reformer, kind of like a middle ground between the stalwarts and the half-breeds. Chester A. Arthur is a stalwart. He's known as a politician from New York, previously a collector of the port, which is a very, corrupt, heavy job, if you will. And prior to this, had no political experience whatsoever. He was also a general in the Civil War for like militia and stuff like that, but extremely inexperienced politician. Do not like him. But again, Garfield's young enough, 49 years old, that there would have been next to no way that Arthur would have even sniffed the presidency at all had it not been for Charles Guiteau. But we don't talk about that. So yeah, under most normal circumstances, Garfield being elected president, perfect. Chester A. Arthur would not have liked that, but again, Garfield's a young guy, had no real big glaring health problems or issues, so there should have been no real reason to get too concerned about that. So we move on to 1884. Current president, of course, is Chester Arthur. Now that Garfield has been assassinated, of course, Arthur actually puts forth, despite the fact that he is a stalwart and is known for, having that more corruption-minded background, that spoil system background, actually puts forth some decent civil service reform. Goes against everything that he stands for and signs a bill that puts forth civil service reform. So that's a good thing. but also modernizes the U.S. Navy too, which is also a good thing. But he's just kind of a meh president. Doesn't really do anything too extreme here. So we have two candidates here who can be appealing in separate ways versus another. So I'll start with the Republican, James G. Blaine. A lot of experience he has, actually. He's from, get this, he's from Maine. Blaine from Maine. Good rhyme. And prior to this, in the late 1860s, early 1870s, he had served in the United States House, managed to get himself elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives, and to this day, as far as I'm aware, is the last major party candidate as of 2024 to have been nominated by a major political party who was a Speaker of the House. After being Speaker of the House for I think 6 years, he was a senator, got chosen by Garfield to be Secretary of State. So again, up until 2016 with Hillary Clinton, the last Secretary of State to be nominated by a major political party. And yeah, just an extremely well-rounded politician, lots of experience, good ideas. I mean, that's a good thing right there. His running mate, John A. Logan, also a lot of good experience there. Senator for a long time from his home state. He was a war hero in the Civil War as well. So a good appealing thing there. So when it comes to experience, James G. Blaine wins tenfold. Platform 2, also pretty decent for the most part. I would argue would have taken, pretty much stood for everything that Arthur was doing and would have expanded upon it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Kind of threw in his own ideas for civil service reform. Didn't really mention civil rights all that much, but then again, neither did Cleveland, so not going to go and expand upon that there. So Platform is decent. Kind of just a continuation on of things that were going on with the current administration, which that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, and this is a big however, the corruption on this man was almost next to none. This election is actually infamous, besides for how close it was, for having a section of the Republican Party called Mugwumps dislike Blaine so much that they actually split off from him and gave enough of their own votes to Cleveland to give him enough to win the election. So let's look at Cleveland real quick. In terms of experience, actually pretty fascinating. No one had as big of a meteoric rise in politics as this man really did. 1881, he was pretty much a low-life nothing, was a typical lawyer from Buffalo. 1882, he is nominated by people who know him to become mayor of Buffalo and wins the election. Becomes known as a person who's actually willing to stand up to corruption, kind of similar to Tilden, and vetoes a whole bunch of bills that he believes does not help governments at all, is wasteful government spending and things like that. So he is a fiscal conservative, and vetoes a ton of bills that he believes does not help out government whatsoever, and eliminates corruption, things like that. The Democratic Party heads see this and nominate him to be governor of New York. He wins that election in 1883 and then is nominated to become president in 1884 and wins the election in 1885. So within the span of 4 years, he rises from becoming pretty much a nobody to becoming mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, and then president within 4 years. Such a huge meteoric rise. It's kind of insane. You really don't see that from anybody else in American history. But being governor of New York for 2 years, despite it's good being a governor of the most populated state in the country, is not really enough for me to call you extremely qualified to be president, especially considering your opponent. So experience-wise, Cleveland loses. Now, with it being said, I say that he actually wins tenfold for me when it comes to everything else. His character, Very honest, humble, genuine person, great leader, always willing to stand up to people who he believes are corrupt and not really well likable. And again, stands up for what he believes in. And he's campaigning on, the idea of draining the swamp, cleaning up Washington, and putting in even more civil service reform than what even Arthur had up to that point. And considering what has happened for the past several elections, he's actually pretty similar to Samuel J. Tilden. And I mentioned how I would have been extremely upset at the election of 1876 and how everything would have went down with that. That would have given me enough of a reason to have wanted to vote for Grover Cleveland for this election. So my vote would have gone to Cleveland in this election because I would have full-heartedly supported his wanting of civil service reform and just his amazing character traits. His running mate was Thomas A. Hendricks, the same one from 1876. Has actually not gained any new political aspects, but again, a lot of good experience. Former governor of Indiana, senator, and member of the House for that state. A very good running mate indeed. He would later die in office, only like 9 months into his term, unfortunately, which would mean that Cleveland was once again without a running mate, without a vice president in office. So we move ahead to 4 years later. 1888, Grover Cleveland is running for re-election with a new running mate, Allen G. Thurman, a 75-year-old Democrat who was a former senator from Ohio, but who was known for being pretty sympathetic towards the South and in supportive of segregation and different things like that. So definitely not a very well-liked individual there. To be fair, Cleveland never really spoke much about civil rights or anything like that either, so the civil rights stuff is kind of out the window for the most part when it comes to the Democrats, and even the Republicans for a certain degree too. But Cleveland's term is fairly successful. He uses the veto more than any other president in American history during his first term alone, with the exception of Franklin D. Roosevelt, but that was a man who was in office for 3 terms, so of course he did more. But if I was alive in 1888, I would have largely been supportive of Grover Cleveland. I already mentioned I like his character. I like that he is very strong, supportive of civil service reform, stands up for what he believes in. He had a successful administration. Everything that I said last time in 1884, bring back here for 1888. Then you look at his opponent, who is Benjamin Harrison. The biggest reason why people did not like Cleveland here was because he lowered tariffs, like, the tax on imported goods in America. And they were afraid of losing their jobs, so they voted for Harrison because they believed he would put forth a higher tariff in order to go and protect those jobs. Harrison's only experience is a senator from Indiana, had been out of office for over a year prior to that. He was a senator for only 1 term during the 1880s, so kind of lackluster there. He's the grandson of William Henry Harrison, but character-wise definitely wasn't as inspiring or charismatic. Actually was known, he had a nickname that I love. He was actually known by people in the Senate as the human iceberg, because he was so cold and distant from people, did not like small talk, did not like socializing with people, came off as a very out of touch and kind of unlikable figure. So he loses for me big time character-wise and experience-wise to Grover Cleveland, so obviously that makes me want to vote for Grover Cleveland for a second term here. But also, he just didn't really give me any decent alternatives that I'd want to work for when it comes to why I should vote for him and not for Cleveland. Like, I do remember that off the top of my head that he did speak out a little bit about giving more voting rights to African Americans, which is extremely important to me. And would definitely have wanted more civil service, more civil rights in that regard, and that's extremely important to me. And again, I can understand the the fear of losing one's job to Cleveland's extreme conservatism, but damn it, he's just such an unlikable figure, and lack of experience does it for me. So yeah, my vote in 1888 would have gone to Grover Cleveland. Before I move on, of course, Harrison's running mate was Levy P. Morton. He was very briefly a representative in the House for one term from New York. He was also a member, kind of similar to Chester A. Arthur, of a very corrupt political machine, the Roscoe Conkling machine. Again, very similar to Chester A. Arthur. Would later get a ambassadorship to France, if I remember correctly. So a little bit of diplomatic experience, tiny bit of legislative experience. Definitely not as much as Alan G. Thurman, but probably would have been a little bit more likable than Alan G. Thurman as a running mate. But yeah, Harrison wins this election. I would have been pretty disappointed. Cleveland probably would have been more from my neck of the woods anyway, and would have stood for things that I think I probably would have wanted more so in the office. Again, I'm not a big fan of conservatism, but just compared to the unlikability of Harrison, Cleveland is a better choice for me here. So we move on to 1892, where we have Benjamin Harrison running for re-election against Grover Cleveland, who's actually coming back, trying to make a comeback for this election, versus a third-party candidate, James B. Weaver, who was known as a populist at this time. Kind of like people who want to go and stand up for the little guys, the farmers out in like the central United States. James B. Weaver is from Iowa, very briefly a member of the House of Representatives. Stood for a lot of things in the populist movement, which is like, again, issuing out greenbacks, which includes like, paper money, going and trying to like stabilize the economy more for the little guys and whatnot, going and trying to help out like farmers and things like that. So he has a very, appealing platform when it comes to what he's running on. His running mate, James G. Field, I actually really did not know that much about, so I'm going to go ahead and look him up real quick. I do remember he has like next to no political experience. Yep. Attorney General of Virginia, which was, over 10 years prior to this, so nothing too exciting there. I would not be in support of Benjamin Harrison, because I would not have liked him the first time, and what he had been doing in office, all the spending of money that he did. I mean, it's the first time in American history our debt goes to over $1 billion while in office. He does sign the Sherman Antitrust Act, which does a big role in combating monopolies and limiting business and how much power they have over the economy, that's good. But his tariff policies are already looking to be hurting the economy very badly. And again, I don't like his character. Definitely did not do a lot of things in office that I would have been extremely supportive of, even though he did call for more civil rights. Didn't really have a big chance to go and implement them. And I do place a lot of the blame on that on his vice president, Levy P. Morton, which, as you can see, is no longer on the as his running mate. It's now the ambassador to France, Whitelaw Reid. There was a bill in the House or in the Senate that would have given more voting rights to African Americans. It came to a stalemate, like it was tied, like 50-50 between the Democrats and the Republicans, and Morton had a chance to go and express interest in this and vote in favor of this bill, but he instead chose to just sit off to the side and not really do anything, thus letting the bill die and pretty much losing all respect from a majority of Republicans and Benjamin Harrison alike. Benjamin Harrison did not like the presidency that much either. His wife actually died during this election, right before the election actually happened. He actually, when he lost this election pretty handily to Cleveland, compared to being released from prison. So he was never very enthusiastic about the presidency to begin with, and I think throughout a lot of his character in office, it kind of shows. And Grover Cleveland, of course, being back, I would have been very excited about that. Again, he would have probably been from where I would have been living at the time in the country, in the northeastern part of the country. I think it would have been me viewing him with rose-colored glasses on, kind of supporting his policies, and knowing that he probably stood the best chance at winning this election. Not to mention, again, I like his character. I like what he stood for, returning back pretty much to his days, if you will. His running mate was Adlai Stevenson the first. He is the first of several Adlai Stevensons in American history. Member of the House of Representatives, 2 terms from Illinois, Assistant Postmaster General, an okay amount of experience, not a lot, but compared to his other 2 running mate opponents, definitely the most. This election, I probably would have been torn between Weaver and Cleveland. I would have liked Weaver's policies quite a bit, but I do like Grover Cleveland as a person. I, again, probably would have been thinking about this with rose-colored glasses being, yeah, I liked what was going on with Cleveland during his time in office. So it would have been close for me, but I probably would have gone and voted for Grover Cleveland again to take back the office. Mostly because I think he had more experience than Weaver. That's a big one for me. He definitely does, because again, as a former president, that gives a lot of points in his corner. And I just felt like he probably would have had more of a better chance to win over Weaver anyway. And again, Cleveland probably would have been kind of closer to where I would have been living at the time anyway, so my bias might have been a little bit towards him as well too. But yeah, so I would have voted for Grover Cleveland in 1892 to take back the White House from Benjamin Harrison. And of course, as you can see, Cleveland does win pretty handily over Benjamin Harrison. But Harrison's administration and its spending causes the Panic of 1893 to happen and pretty much tanks Cleveland's reputation completely. He does a very poor job of responding to it, not that he had much of a chance anyway. And his response to the panic, along with his response to the Pullman strike of 1894, where he sends federal troops to break up a strike of people who are protesting against unfair wages, would have definitely turned me off against Grover Cleveland, and I probably would have regretted voting for him at this point, and would have probably wanted to have gone with Weaver instead. So, yeah, definitely would not have been very happy with the Democrats at this point in time, especially with Cleveland. So we jump ahead to 1896, and boy howdy, we have ourselves an extremely amazing candidate here that the Democrats have decided to nominate, endorsed with the populist movement. So it's pretty much James B. Weaver would have supported this guy. And this is William Jennings Bryan. He is a 2-term representative from Nebraska, so not a lot of experience there. But what he lacks in experience, he more than makes up for in just his passion, character, and just the dedication that he holds in his beliefs for the government. Easy proof enough, his Cross of Gold speech, going and becoming extremely passionate towards the free coinage of silver, which he believed and very well likely could have rebounded the economy very well and given more of a voice and, I guess, power to the little guy, the common people, especially the more poor people in the Central America, like the farmers. An amazing speaker, very charismatic. I definitely would have supported a lot of the things that he stood for. So yeah, so I definitely would have been a big William Jennings Bryan fan, even despite the fact that he was not a very experienced candidate. His running mate is Arthur Sewell, who had never held public office before. He was a shipbuilder and a businessman from Maine, pretty much only chosen to A, balance the ticket regionally, and B, maybe share some of his wealth to the campaign, which he ultimately didn't. but whatever. Probably would have made an awful vice president, but whatever. And then his opponent is William McKinley, the governor of Ohio, and was in the House of Representatives for quite some time. Was known for his McKinley tariff, which was actually the reason why the economy kind of tanked in the first place, because Benjamin Harrison signed that, and definitely tanked the economy worse than it should have. So I would not have been super enthusiastic about William McKinley. He is a pro gold standard person, definitely not as enthusiastic of a candidate as Bryan was, and was passionate. Is also kind of well known for being associated with the business side of things, kind of more on the corrupt side of things. The only people who really people who supported McKinley's campaign were like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, those kind of people who were pretty much going and supporting him because Bryan was so against those type of like monopolies of people going and like wanting to go and shatter them and things like that, standing up for the little guy. So they paid big money to finance and support McKinley's campaign, because McKinley was not like that whatsoever. I don't think it should come as too much of a surprise that that turns me up big time from the McKinley campaign. I would not have really stood for or supported what McKinley was campaigning for as much as I would have for Bryan. His running mate was Garrett Hobart, who was a member of several different members of like the House and the Senate in New Jersey, but he had never held political office on a national level. It was only from a state level, so also very little experience, but hey, this man had no experience at all, so at least this running mate has something. So this ticket would have been appealing to me for experience versus this ticket, but when it comes to pretty much everything else, I would not have liked what the Republicans were standing for. So no surprise here, my vote in 1896 would have gone to William Jennings Bryan. Now the final election I'll look for, I will cover in this video, is the election of 1900. William McKinley has been in office for 4 years now. The economy has rebounded. It is actually doing very, very well. So William McKinley is pretty much standing in for continuation of my policies, which at this point in time, even though I would probably not have been a big fan of some of the way he was handling the wars that we had gotten involved with, the Spanish-American War, even though we won it, we did a pretty good job with that, and the Philippine-American War, which I am not so sure how well was known to the American public at the time, but even still, probably would not have been a big fan of all of these, we're going and taking over all of these countries and whatnot, just because we want to go and implement democracy in these other countries when they never asked for it. Like, that's kind of iffy, and definitely something that would play against him in my book. McKinley's running mate, of course, is the legendary Theodore Roosevelt, who at this point was not extremely well known. He was governor of New York, had previously been assistant secretary of the Navy to McKinley, was a kind of like a pretend war hero to the in the Spanish-American War. So he was a colonel, preferred to be called Colonel Roosevelt instead of President Roosevelt. He insisted upon it. So a very charismatic, inspiring figure. I mean, come on, it's Theodore Roosevelt. How could he not be? So, very great choice in running mate. Not extremely excited about William McKinley again. I don't like him personally as a person, as a character, but he is definitely more experienced than his opponent, which is, again, William Jennings Bryan, which I'll get to in just a second. And as you can see, I would have voted for William McKinley again versus over William Jennings Bryan because he has the experience, and even though, again, the world stage that was going on at the time under William McKinley's administration, the economy was doing better. And overall, I kind of feel like McKinley's term would have been a success. So I would have wanted to have continued with that versus going and voting for William Jennings Bryan, who, although again, yes, very charismatic speaker, does lack the experience, of course, and does stand for good things regardless. I think I would have just been more drawn towards just keeping things going as they are for McKinley versus going and trying to change things up with Bryan. It just wouldn't have made sense for me to go and change things up. Even though I don't like McKinley personally, what he's been doing in office has been satisfying enough that I would have been okay with keeping him in there. Of course, Bryan's running mate was Adlai Stevenson, again, the former vice president to Grover Cleveland. Good choice. Not as good as Theodore Roosevelt, of course, but we wouldn't know about Theodore Roosevelt until later. So yeah, so that is the final election I'll be looking for. I'll be looking at in this video. In the next video, we'll be going from 1904 until 2016. I'm not going to go into 2020 because that was the first election I actually ever voted in legally. And I do not want to go and reveal too much exactly who or what I voted for at this time. And I'm definitely not going to go and reveal my 2024 thoughts at this time. So I will go up until 2016. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. And enjoy yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.